Welcome, weary traveller of the endless seas, to the extraordinary chronicle of one whose kicks would become legend and whose heart would prove stronger than any royal bloodline. Tonight, we trace the complete journey of Blackleg Sanji, from a prince who fell from grace to the cook whose meals carry the taste of dreams themselves. This is a tale of sacrifice written in smoke and flame, of family bonds forged in kitchens rather than birthed in palaces, and of a man who chose humanity over power at every crossroads of his destiny. So settle in. Let the gentle aroma of distant spices carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore every triumph, every loss, and every moment that transformed a broken child into the chef who would feed the future pirate king. In the year 1970, on a floating kingdom that drifted across the North Blue like a mechanical island divorced from natural law, a child was born who would one day reject everything his birthright promised him. The Germa kingdom existed as a testament to scientific ambition unchecked by moral consideration, its ships locking together to form a nation that recognized no borders save those imposed by the will of its ruler. Here, among laboratories that hummed with the machinery of human enhancement and corridors that echoed with the footsteps of cloned soldiers, Vinsmoke Sanji entered a world that would try to strip away his humanity before he was old enough to understand what humanity meant. His father, Judge, possessed the kind of brilliance that history would remember as either visionary or monstrous, depending on who survived to write the accounts. The head of the Vinsmoke family had spent decades perfecting the science of human modification, driven by dreams of reclaiming the North Blue territories that his ancestors had once ruled through conventional conquest. But Judge's ambitions extended far beyond mere territorial expansion. He sought to create a new breed of human being, soldiers who possessed all the strength and skill of natural warriors, while lacking the emotional weaknesses that had historically limited military effectiveness. The Vinsmoke children were to be the prototypes for this new breed of humanity, their genetic structure altered while still in the womb to eliminate compassion, fear, and every other feeling that might interfere with perfect obedience to their father's commands. Ichiji, Niji, and Yonji emerged from their artificial wombs as Judge had intended, physically superior beings whose enhanced strength was matched only by their complete indifference to the suffering of others. They possessed exoskeletons that made their skin harder than steel, reflexes that operated faster than normal human nervous systems could process, and hearts that beat without ever experiencing doubt or mercy. But Sora, their mother, had harbored different dreams for her unborn children. In the quiet hours when Judge's attention was focused on his laboratories and strategic planning, she had made a choice that would echo through generations, consuming drugs that would counteract the genetic modifications, sacrificing her own health in a desperate gamble to preserve at least one child's capacity for human feeling. The medicine that slowly destroyed her body was her final gift to a son she would never see grow to manhood. A mother's love expressed through the willing acceptance of her own destruction. The effects of Sora's sacrifice became apparent as the Vinsmoke children grew from infants into walking demonstrations of their father's scientific capabilities. Ichiji, Niji, and Yonji developed exactly as planned. Their enhanced bodies, housing minds that processed the world in terms of efficiency and utility, rather than emotional connection. They could observe suffering without feeling moved to intervene, could inflict pain without experiencing guilt, could follow orders without questioning the moral implications of their actions. They were, in every measurable way, perfect soldiers for the kind of warfare Judge envisioned. Sanji represented the failure of this perfect system, a flaw in the design that manifested as stubborn humanity in a family that had scientifically eliminated such inconveniences, where his brothers possessed skin that could deflect blades, Sanji bruised and bled like any normal child. Where they moved with the mechanical precision of enhanced reflexes, he stumbled and fell with ordinary clumsiness. Most damning of all, where they observed the world with cold calculation, Sanji responded to others' pain with tears, to injustice with anger, to kindness with gratitude that Judge considered weakness of the most dangerous variety. The hierarchy within the Vinsmoke family established itself through violence as natural as breathing, the enhanced children asserting dominance over their normal brother, with the casual cruelty of predators playing with prey they had no intention of consuming. Ichiji's red hair seemed to burn with the same intensity as his contempt for weakness, his attacks on Sanji, carrying the methodical precision of someone testing the limits of what damage could be inflicted without crossing the line into permanent disability. Niji's blue locks matched the coldness in his eyes as he devised increasingly elaborate ways to humiliate his brother, each assault carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. Yonji, the youngest of the enhanced siblings, perhaps inflicted the cruelest wounds of all through his complete indifference to Sanji's existence, treating his normal brother less like family and more like a curiosity that occasionally wandered into his field of vision. The green-haired boy's casual dismissal of Sanji's dreams, his mockery of emotions he could not comprehend, created isolation that cut deeper than any physical blow his brothers might deliver. Only Reiju seemed to retain traces of the humanity that Judge had tried to eliminate, though even her compassion was constrained by the political realities of their family structure. The pink-haired eldest child walked a precarious line between genuine affection for Sanji and the necessity of maintaining her position within Judge's hierarchy, her protection taking forms so subtle that even Sanji sometimes questioned whether he was imagining the small kindnesses she managed to provide. The training sessions that Judge imposed upon his children served multiple purposes beyond simple physical conditioning. They were laboratories where the effectiveness of his genetic modifications could be measured against conventional human limitations, demonstrations of superiority that reinforced the family's power structure while identifying any weaknesses that might require correction. Sanji's consistent failure to match his brother's performance became a source of embarrassment that Judge initially attributed to insufficient motivation rather than fundamental genetic differences. The breaking point arrived not through any single act of cruelty, but through the accumulation of countless small humiliations that finally convinced Judge that his third son represented a flaw too significant to ignore. The iron mask that he ordered placed over Sanji's face served practical and symbolic purposes. It hid the shame of his failure from public view, while serving as a constant reminder of the boy's worthlessness. The dungeon cell where Sanji spent the next 6 months became his first lesson in the price of being different in a world that valued conformity above all other virtues. The darkness of imprisonment might have broken a different child, but Sanji's time in the dungeon became a period of unexpected discovery rather than simple punishment. The cookbook that he found among the cell's meager furnishings opened windows to possibilities that his father's laboratories had never contained, describing techniques for transforming simple ingredients into meals that could nourish both body and soul. More importantly, it spoke of the All Blue, a legendary sea where ingredients from all 4 corners of the world converged in perfect harmony. The All Blue became more than a geographical destination in Sanji's imagination. It represented everything that his family's sterile pursuit of perfection could never achieve. Where Judge sought to eliminate variables and control outcomes, the All Blue celebrated diversity and unexpected combinations. Where the Vinsmoke philosophy demanded uniformity of thought and purpose, the legendary sea promised infinite variety and the kind of creative freedom that could only exist when different elements were allowed to interact without predetermined constraints. Reiju's visits to his cell provided the only human contact Sanji experienced during those long months. Her medical attention to his injuries serving as both practical necessity and emotional lifeline. Her conflicted expressions as she tended his wounds spoke to internal struggles that she could never voice aloud. The tension between her genuine love for her brother and her understanding that open defiance of their father's will would result in consequences that neither of them could survive. The conversations they shared in whispered tones revealed depths to Reiju's character that the world would never see. Her questions about his dreams and his stubborn refusal to abandon them despite every rational reason to do so. She became his link to a world beyond the cell walls, bringing news of the outside that fed his imagination while carefully avoiding any information that might inspire hope for rescue or escape. The escape that eventually came was orchestrated not through external intervention but through Reiju's careful manipulation of circumstances that had aligned to create a narrow window of opportunity. The Germa Kingdom's transition from North Blue to East Blue provided cover for activities that would normally have attracted too much attention. The chaos of repositioning an entire floating nation, creating distractions that could mask one small act of rebellion. The night of his liberation carried weight that extended far beyond simple freedom from imprisonment. It represented the first time anyone in his family had chosen his well-being over their own safety. Reiju's decision to help him escape, putting her at risk in ways that demonstrated a love deeper than any words could express. Her tears as she unlocked his cell door spoke to the magnitude of what she was sacrificing. The knowledge that this moment of compassion might be the last kind act she could ever perform for the brother she was losing forever. The key to his iron mask felt heavier than its physical weight should have allowed, each turn of the lock releasing not just metal restraints, but years of accumulated shame and self-doubt that Judge's treatment had embedded in his young psyche. The face that emerged from behind the mask bore scars that would never fully heal, but also eyes that still held the capacity for dreams that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Judge's final confrontation with his escaping son carried the weight of absolute finality, both father and child understanding that this moment would define their relationship for whatever time remained to them. The cruel bargain that Judge offered, freedom in exchange for the complete erasure of family connection, represented his last attempt to control a son who had never fit into his carefully constructed vision of genetic superiority. Sanji's acceptance of these terms came not from weakness but from strength, the recognition that some prices were worth paying for the chance to become something greater than his birth circumstances had intended. The tears he shed as he agreed to pretend his family had never existed were not expressions of defeat but declarations of independence, each drop carrying away another fragment of the identity that had been imposed upon him rather than chosen. The cruise ship orbit represented more than simple transportation away from everything he had known. It was his first glimpse of a world where people could exist without constant fear of violence, where meals were shared in joy rather than consumed in suspicious silence, where dreams were discussed as possibilities rather than dismissed as weaknesses. The kitchen work he found aboard the vessel provided structure for days that had previously been defined by pain and confinement. His natural talent with food preparation, offering the first positive reinforcement he had ever received for abilities that came from within, rather than genetic enhancement. But even aboard the orbit, surrounded by people who treated him with casual kindness rather than calculated cruelty, Sanji carried scars that would influence every relationship he formed for the rest of his life. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in the Vinsmoke household made it difficult to trust even genuine gestures of friendship. His expectation of eventual betrayal, creating barriers that well-meaning companions found difficult to understand or overcome. The dreams of all blue that sustained him through the darkest moments of his imprisonment became his guiding star as he sailed toward an uncertain future, the legendary sea representing everything he hoped to discover about himself and the world beyond his father's laboratory. Each sunset carried him further from the mechanical precision of Germa's floating kingdom toward possibilities that existed beyond the reach of scientific manipulation, toward a destiny that he would have to create through his own choices, rather than inherit through genetic design. The boy who had once been deemed a failure by the most exacting scientific standards was learning to see his differences as strengths rather than weaknesses, his capacity for emotion as a gift rather than a curse, his stubborn humanity as the foundation upon which he could build whatever future he possessed the courage to imagine. The iron mask lay discarded in his wake, but the freedom it represented would prove far more difficult to fully claim than simply removing a piece of metal from his face. As the orbit carried him toward the East Blue and whatever adventures awaited there, Sanji stood at the ship's rail with his face turned toward horizons that held no trace of his past, the salt air carrying promises of transformation that no laboratory could engineer and no father could prevent. The prince who had fallen from grace was learning to fly with wings that had never been clipped by anyone else's expectations, soaring toward a destiny that would be measured not in power accumulated but in lives touched by kindness freely given. The orbit cut through the waters of the East Blue like a vessel carrying dreams toward destiny, her passengers unaware that among their number sailed a boy whose future would reshape the very foundations of the pirate world. The cruise ship represented civilization at its most hopeful, families traveling to reunite with distant relatives, merchants pursuing opportunities in foreign ports, adventurers seeking new experiences in waters that promised gentler challenges than the Grand Line's legendary storms. For Sanji, still adjusting to freedom after months of imprisonment, the ship's bustling activity provided a fascinating study in how people could coexist without constant fear of violence or betrayal. The kitchen aboard the Orbit became his sanctuary within this floating microcosm of ordinary life, the first place where his natural talents were recognized as assets, rather than dismissed as irrelevant curiosities. The head cook, a gruff but fair man named Baptiste, who had spent decades perfecting his craft on passenger vessels, initially viewed the young stowaway with the suspicious eye of someone who had learned to distrust unexpected complications. But Sanji's instinctive understanding of flavor combinations, his willingness to work longer hours than crew members twice his age, and his obvious reverence for ingredients gradually earned him acceptance within the galley's hierarchical structure. The work itself provided healing that Sanji had not known he needed. Each perfectly diced onion and properly seasoned sauce, representing small victories against the voice in his head that insisted he was worthless, that his gentleness was weakness, that his capacity for joy was somehow shameful. The other kitchen workers, drawn from ports across the East Blue, carried their own stories of hardship overcome through dedication to their craft, their casual acceptance of his presence providing the first sense of belonging he had experienced since Reiju's secret visits to his dungeon cell. But it was the cookbook he had discovered during his imprisonment that truly opened the door to understanding what his life might become, its pages describing techniques and ingredients that existed far beyond the sterile laboratories of his father's floating kingdom. The section devoted to the All Blue captured his imagination with descriptions of a legendary sea where currents from all four blues converged, creating an ecosystem so rich and diverse that chefs who reached it would find ingredients that existed nowhere else in the world. The other cooks dismissed his excited questions about the All Blue with the patronizing patience of adults indulging a child's fantasy, their laughter carrying no malice, but demonstrating how thoroughly they had accepted the limitations that experience had taught them to expect. Baptiste's weathered face would crease into indulgent smiles whenever Sanji brought up the legendary sea, his gentle corrections about the difference between maritime myths and achievable goals delivered with the kindness of someone who had once harbored similar dreams before life taught him to be more practical. But their skepticism only strengthened Sanji's determination to prove that impossible things could become possible for those who possessed sufficient courage to pursue them beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom. Late at night, when his duties in the galley were complete and the ship's passengers had settled into sleep, he would study his cookbook by lamplight, memorizing recipes that called for ingredients he had never seen, while imagining the flavors that such exotic combinations might produce. The attack came without warning on a morning when the sea stretched peaceful and blue in all directions, the kind of perfect sailing weather that made passengers comment on their good fortune while crew members relaxed their vigilance just enough to make tragedy inevitable. The cook pirate's ship appeared on the horizon like a dark punctuation mark against the pristine canvas of sky and water, their black flag announcing intentions that needed no further clarification. Red-Leg Zeph commanded his crew with the casual efficiency of someone who had transformed piracy from mere criminal activity into a refined art form, his reputation built on strategic brilliance rather than mindless violence. The cook pirates were known throughout the North Blue and beyond for their ability to extract maximum profit from their targets while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. Their leader's philosophy that dead passengers provided no repeat business, making him paradoxically more successful than pirates who relied purely on intimidation and murder. The boarding of the orbit proceeded with mechanical precision that spoke to years of practice perfecting their technique. Zeph's crew moving through the ship like professionals, executing a well-rehearsed performance. Passengers who cooperated found themselves treated with surprising courtesy, their valuables confiscated but their persons left unmolested, while those who offered resistance discovered that the cook pirates' restraint had definite limits that were enforced with swift and decisive action. Sanji's first glimpse of Zeph came as the pirate captain surveyed the galley with the appraising eye of someone who understood that a ship's kitchen revealed more about its true character than any amount of superficial luxury in the passenger quarters. The red-stained boots that had earned Zeph his infamous nickname showed no trace of fresh blood, but their color served as a constant reminder of the violence he was capable of unleashing when circumstances demanded such measures. The confrontation that followed would be remembered by survivors as a clash between two individuals who possessed the kind of stubborn determination that could reshape reality through sheer force of will. Sanji, armed with nothing more than a kitchen knife and the desperate courage of someone who had already lost everything that mattered, faced down a pirate whose reputation extended across multiple seas, while declaring his intention to protect the ship's supplies and passengers. Zeph's initial amusement at this challenge gradually transformed into something approaching respect as Sanji demonstrated fighting skills that no ordinary kitchen assistant should have possessed, his movements carrying traces of formal training that suggested a background far more complex than his humble position aboard the cruise ship indicated. The knife work that served Sanji so well in food preparation translated surprisingly effectively to combat, his precision with blades creating tactical opportunities that forced even experienced pirates to approach him with caution. But it was Sanji's passionate declaration about his dreams that truly captured Zeph's attention. The boy's insistence that he would not die before reaching the All Blue, resonating with something deep in the pirate captain's own heavily guarded heart, where other members of Zeph's crew heard only the foolish boasting of a child who had read too many adventure stories. Their leader recognized the authentic voice of someone whose dreams were large enough to reshape the world if given sufficient time and opportunity to flourish. The revelation that Zeph himself had searched for the legendary sea throughout his years of piracy created a moment of connection that transcended the immediate circumstances of their meeting. Two dreamers recognizing each other across the artificial barriers of age, experience, and current opposing positions. The all-blue represented more than a geographical destination to both of them. It was the symbol of everything that made life worth living, despite the hardships and disappointments that seemed designed to crush human spirits. Their philosophical discussion about the nature of dreams and the prices that pursuing them demanded might have continued indefinitely, but the storm that had been building on the horizon finally announced its arrival with winds that transformed the previously calm sea into a battlefield where human conflicts became irrelevant compared to the raw power of natural forces, unleashed without restraint or mercy. The hurricane that struck both ships with equal ferocity demonstrated the ocean's complete indifference to human ambitions. Its winds and waves treating pirates and passengers with the same casual destruction that reduced carefully planned voyages to desperate struggles for survival. The orbit, built for comfort rather than severe weather, began taking on water almost immediately, her elegant superstructure becoming liability rather than asset, as the storm tested every joint and seam beyond the limits of their original design specifications. Zeph's ship, constructed according to specifications that prioritized survival over luxury, managed the storm's initial assault more successfully, but even her reinforced hull groaned under pressures that seemed designed to demonstrate the ultimate futility of human efforts to impose order upon the chaos that ruled the natural world. The Cook pirates found themselves fighting not for treasure but for their lives, their professional competence in combat providing little advantage against an enemy that could not be intimidated or outmaneuvered. The moment when Sanji disappeared beneath the churning waters marked the transformation of everything that followed, his small form vanishing into the storm-darkened sea like a stone dropped into an abyss that offered no promise of return. For Zeph, watching from the deck of his own endangered vessel, the sight triggered instincts that operated below the level of conscious decision-making, his body moving toward the water before his mind had fully processed the implications of what he was attempting. The rescue that followed was accomplished through combination of skill, determination, and luck that made survival seem almost miraculous in retrospect. Zeph's powerful swimming abilities and intimate knowledge of ocean currents enabling him to locate and retrieve the unconscious boy despite conditions that would have defeated lesser watermen. But salvation came at a price that would influence every decision either of them made for the remainder of their lives. The injury that crushed Zeph's leg during the rescue, ensuring that even if they survived the immediate crisis, the consequences would follow them forever. The barren rock where the storm finally deposited them rose from the sea like a monument to desolation, its weathered surfaces offering no vegetation, no shelter, and no fresh water beyond what could be collected during the increasingly rare rainfall that provided their only relief from the constant threat of dehydration. The island's complete lack of resources made their situation clear from the moment consciousness returned. They possessed a finite supply of food that would sustain one person for perhaps 80 days, but two people for considerably less time. Zeph's decision to divide their meager supplies appeared generous on its surface, the larger portion he claimed for himself seemingly confirming Sanji's worst fears about adult nature and the selfishness that desperation could inspire even in those who had previously shown signs of nobility. The smaller bag of provisions that became Sanji's responsibility carried weight that extended far beyond its physical mass, each carefully rationed meal representing another day of life purchased through the systematic consumption of hope. The days that followed established a routine of survival that tested every aspect of their characters, while the endless expanse of empty ocean mocked their hopes for rescue with its persistent refusal to yield even a single sail on the Washen distant horizon. Sanji's rationing of his supplies demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. His careful calculation of nutritional needs, balanced against the uncertainty of how long their ordeal might continue, creating a framework for endurance that kept despair at manageable distances. The conversations they shared during those long days revealed depths to both their personalities that might never have emerged under different circumstances. Zeph's stories of life on the seas providing education about the wider world, while Sanji's questions and observations offered perspectives that forced the old pirate to examine assumptions he had never previously questioned. Their discussions of the All Blue became more than simple fantasies. They were blueprints for the kinds of lives they hoped to build if survival proved possible. But hunger was a patient enemy that could not be defeated through courage or cleverness. Its gradual erosion of strength and clarity, making each day more difficult than the last, while the ocean continued its cruel refusal to provide any sign that rescue might eventually arrive. Sanji's growing weakness became increasingly difficult to hide. His attempts to maintain normal activity levels betrayed by trembling hands and moments of dizziness that spoke to the systematic failure of a body consuming itself to sustain consciousness. The breaking point arrived not through dramatic crisis, but through the simple accumulation of desperation that finally overcame Sanji's respect for Zeph's claimed territory. His approach to the larger bag of supplies motivated less by greed than by the basic survival instinct that had kept him alive through every previous trial his short life had presented. The discovery that awaited him inside that carefully guarded sack would haunt him for the remainder of his days, its implications reaching far beyond the immediate circumstances of their shared imprisonment on the lifeless rock. The treasure that filled Zeph's bag spoke to sacrifices that no child should have been forced to witness. The gold and jewels representing wealth that could have purchased passage to any destination in the world, if only there had been ships available to charter or merchants willing to trade survival for precious metals. But the true treasure was the empty space where food should have been. The hollow mockery of provisions that revealed the depth of Zeph's commitment to preserving a life that was not his own. The crude medical evidence of Zeph's ultimate sacrifice created understanding that words could never have conveyed. The bandaged stump where his leg had once been telling a story of dedication that transcended every boundary that normally separated strangers from family. The realization that Zeph had been surviving on nothing more substantial than determination and seawater transformed Sanji's understanding not only of their immediate situation, but of the kinds of love that could exist between people who had no biological connection. The rescue ship that finally appeared on the horizon arrived at the exact moment when hope had dwindled to its final embers, their salvation emerging from morning mist like a materialization of answered prayers that neither survivor had dared to voice aloud. The crew members who pulled them aboard their vessel would later report that both castaways wept openly upon seeing other human faces, their tears carrying the accumulated weight of isolation that had nearly broken spirits stronger than steel. The medical attention they received during the journey to port provided physical healing that their weeks on the barren rock had made desperately necessary, but the emotional bonds forged through shared suffering would prove far more durable than any injury that proper nutrition and rest could address. Zeph's explanation of his decision to sacrifice his leg, and with it his career as an active pirate, was delivered with the matter-of-fact directness of someone stating obvious truth rather than describing heroic action. The dream of opening a restaurant that would serve anyone who needed food, regardless of their ability to pay or their reputation in the wider world, emerged naturally from their shared understanding of what hunger could do to human dignity, and their mutual commitment to ensuring that others would never endure what they had experienced on that lifeless rock. The barity would become more than a business venture. It would be their monument to the power of compassion over pragmatism generosity over greed. But the restaurant remained a future aspiration during those first days of recovery. When Sanji struggled to process the magnitude of what Zeph had given up for his sake, while the older man planned practical details of how they might transform dreams into sustainable reality. The debt that Sanji felt he owed could never be repaid through conventional means, its weight creating obligations that would shape every decision he made, while simultaneously inspiring him to become worthy of such extraordinary sacrifice. The port where their rescue ship finally docked represented the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives, but also the end of the innocence that had allowed Sanji to believe that good intentions were sufficient protection against the world's cruelties. He had learned through the most direct possible experience that survival sometimes demanded prices that no reasonable person should have to pay, that love could express itself through sacrifice so profound that it redefined the boundaries of what one person could mean to another. As they walked down the gangplank together, Zeph leaning heavily on the crutch that would be his companion for the remainder of his days, Sanji understood that his life had been purchased through another man's deliberate choice to value a stranger's future above his own physical wholeness. The boy who had dreamed of finding the All Blue now carried responsibility for justifying that sacrifice, for becoming someone whose survival had been worth the price that Zeph had willingly paid without complaint or expectation of gratitude. The floating restaurant that would become their shared life's work existed only in imagination during those first steps onto solid ground, but already the foundation had been laid through bonds stronger than blood, through understanding deeper than words, through the recognition that some relationships are forged not through accident of birth, but through conscious choices made in moments when character is tested beyond all normal limits and found sufficient to bear whatever weight the world might place upon it. The construction of Baratie began not with grand architectural plans or elaborate financing schemes, but with two men standing on a dock in the East Blue, sharing a vision that seemed impossible to everyone except themselves. Zeph's savings from years of successful piracy provided the initial capital, but the real foundation of their floating restaurant was built from determination that had been tempered in the crucible of shared survival and mutual sacrifice. The shipwrights who took their commission initially approached the project with skepticism that gradually transformed into enthusiasm as they realized they were not simply building another vessel but creating something entirely new in the maritime world. The design that emerged from their collaboration reflected both men's understanding of what their restaurant needed to accomplish. It would serve as neutral ground where pirates and marines could dine in peace, a sanctuary where the ocean's harsh realities could be temporarily set aside in favor of the civilizing influence of good food and shared humanity. The kitchen occupied the heart of the structure, its efficient layout reflecting years of experience with the practical demands of feeding large groups under challenging conditions, while the dining areas were positioned to take advantage of natural light and ocean views that would remind patrons of the vast world beyond their immediate conflicts. Sanji's growth during the construction period was measured not just in physical stature, but in the development of skills that would define his approach to both cooking and combat for the remainder of his life. Zeph's instruction carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, each lesson delivered with the gruff affection of someone who had learned that the most valuable gifts were often disguised as harsh criticism. The old pirate's teaching methods might have seemed cruel to outside observers, but Sanji understood that every bruise earned in training was preparation for challenges that would test him far more severely. The fundamental principle that would guide everything about Baratie's operation was established during those early days when the restaurant existed more as concept than reality. No one would be turned away from their table because of hunger, regardless of their ability to pay, their reputation in the wider world, or their current relationship with law enforcement. This rule was not born from naive idealism, but from both men's intimate understanding of what starvation could do to human dignity, their shared commitment to ensuring that the desperation they had experienced on that barren rock would never be repeated in any place they possessed the power to prevent it. The sacred nature of food became more than philosophical position in Sanji's education. It was the foundation upon which every other skill would be built. Zeph's insistence that wasting ingredients was tantamount to desecrating something holy might have seemed excessive to casual observers, but it reflected deep respect for the labor that brought food from farm to table, and the reality that somewhere in the world, someone was going hungry while others treated abundance with casual indifference. Each perfectly prepared meal became an offering to ideals that transcended mere sustenance to encompass reverence for life itself. The fighting techniques that Zeph taught alongside culinary skills reflected his understanding that running a restaurant in pirate-infested waters would require the ability to defend their principles through force when diplomacy proved insufficient. The restriction of Sanji's hands to cooking purposes only was not arbitrary limitation, but recognition that a chef's most valuable tools must be protected at all costs. His ability to create the meals that gave their establishment meaning depended on fingers that remained sensitive, enough to detect the subtle differences in texture that separated adequate food from transcendent cuisine. The development of leg-based combat techniques demanded flexibility and strength that went far beyond normal human parameters. Zeph's own fighting style adapted to accommodate the limitations imposed by his missing limb, while maximizing the power that could be generated through precise application of force to vulnerable targets. Sanji's natural agility made him an ideal student for techniques that emphasized speed and accuracy over brute strength, his movements gradually acquiring the fluid grace that would one day make his kicks indistinguishable from dance to those privileged to witness his fighting at its finest. The daily sparring sessions that punctuated their routine carried emotional weight that extended far beyond simple physical training. Each exchange serving as complicated dialogue between mentor and student about expectations, disappointments, and the gradual development of skills that might one day prove adequate to the challenges that awaited them. Zeph's criticism was never casual cruelty, but rather the expression of someone who understood that the world would test Sanji far more harshly than any training could simulate. That preparation for such trials required pushing beyond the boundaries of what seemed possible or reasonable. The opening of Bharati marked the realization of dreams that had sustained both men through their darkest moments, but also the beginning of challenges that theory and planning could never have fully anticipated. The first customers who discovered their floating restaurant approached with the wariness of people who had learned to expect disappointment from establishments that promised more than they could deliver, their skepticism gradually dissolving as they experienced food prepared with skill and served with genuine hospitality that acknowledged their dignity regardless of their circumstances. The reputation that gradually spread throughout the East Blue was built one meal at a time, each satisfied customer becoming an advertisement for the kind of establishment that Bharati represented. Pirates who had grown accustomed to eating poorly prepared food from crews whose cooks viewed their duties as burdensome chores found themselves returning repeatedly to experience cuisine that treated their palates with the same respect, normally reserved for paying passengers on luxury liners. Marines, whose official duties required them to maintain suspicious distance from civilian establishments, discovered that Bharati's neutrality extended to protecting them from the kind of political pressures that could make simple meals into complicated diplomatic incidents. The code of conduct that governed behavior within Bharati's walls was enforced not through posted regulations but through Sanji's absolute willingness to physically remove anyone whose actions threatened the sanctuary they had worked so hard to establish. His kicks, delivered with precision that could disable without permanently maiming, became legendary among the restaurant's regular clientele as demonstrations of what happened when someone confused hospitality with weakness. The sight of troublemakers sailing through windows to land in the ocean below served as effective deterrent to others who might have considered testing the establishment's commitment to maintaining peaceful atmosphere. The relationship between Zeph and Sanji during these operational years resembled that of father and son in every way except biological connection. Their arguments, carrying the comfortable familiarity of people who could express frustration without fear that conflict would damage bonds, forged in circumstances far more challenging than any disagreement about restaurant management could create. Their public disputes often masked private pride in each other's development, Zeph's harsh criticism of Sanji's cooking serving as motivation for improvement, while his defense of the young man against outside threats demonstrated protective instincts that required no verbal explanation. The customers who became regulars at Barati found themselves welcomed into something approaching extended family, their personal stories and preferences remembered with the kind of attention normally reserved for blood relatives. Pirates who had spent years viewing every interaction as potential prelude to betrayal gradually learned to trust in the genuine neutrality that allowed them to share meals with Marines who had been hunting them just hours earlier, the restaurant's atmosphere creating temporary truces that sometimes evolved into permanent changes in how former enemies viewed each other. Sanji's development of his personal code regarding women emerged naturally from Zeph's teachings about respect and protection, but was refined through his own observations of how the world treated those who possessed physical vulnerability despite possessing strength in other areas. The absolute prohibition against striking women, regardless of provocation or circumstances, represented his commitment to ideals that transcended tactical considerations to encompass moral boundaries that would never be crossed regardless of personal cost. The kitchen itself became Sanji's domain in ways that went beyond mere professional responsibility. His intuitive understanding of flavor combinations and cooking techniques surpassing even Zeph's considerable expertise, as the young man's natural talents were refined through years of dedicated practice. The transformation of raw ingredients into meals that could satisfy both physical hunger and emotional needs became art form that elevated cooking from mere craft to something approaching sacred calling. Each dish prepared with attention to detail that honored both the ingredients and the people who would consume them. The floating restaurant's unique position in East Blue society created opportunities for Sanji to observe human nature in its full complexity, from the desperate gratitude of starving pirates to the casual arrogance of wealthy passengers who had never experienced genuine hardship. These encounters broadened his understanding of the world beyond the artificial constraints of his father's laboratory, teaching him that strength and weakness could exist in the same person depending on circumstances, that nobility of spirit was not determined by birth or wealth, but by choices made when tested by adversity. The dreams of all blue that had sustained him through imprisonment and shipwreck remained alive despite the satisfaction he found in his daily work, the legendary sea representing not escape from his current life, but the ultimate expression of everything he was learning about the relationship between ingredients, preparation, and the joy that perfect meals could create. His conversations with Zeph about the mythical convergence of all four seas took on new dimensions as his culinary expertise grew, their shared vision evolving from simple fantasy into detailed planning for the kind of expedition that might actually locate the elusive waters. The training regimen that continued even after Barati's successful establishment reflected both men's understanding that the skills required for survival in their chosen profession could never be considered complete, that each day brought new challenges that demanded constant adaptation and improvement. Sanji's kicks grew more powerful and precise through endless practice, his movements incorporating lessons learned from observing the fighting styles of customers whose battles in the wider world provided education that no formal instruction could match. The loyalty that developed between Sanji and the other cooks who eventually joined Bharati's staff was built through shared commitment to the principles that governed their establishment rather than mere professional obligation. The kitchen became a place where former pirates, discharged marines, and civilian refugees could find purpose and belonging, regardless of their past mistakes or current limitations. Their collective dedication to excellence in food preparation, creating bonds that transcended the artificial divisions imposed by the outside world's political conflicts. The financial success that eventually rewarded their efforts was measured not merely in berries earned, but in the number of people whose lives were improved through access to good food served without judgment or conditions. The restaurant that had begun as monument to survival and sacrifice evolved into institution that demonstrated how individual choices to treat others with dignity could create ripple effects that influenced entire communities, their example inspiring similar establishments throughout the East Blue. But perhaps the greatest achievement of these years was the gradual healing of wounds that neither Sanji nor Zeph had initially recognized they carried. The daily routine of creating joy through food preparation, providing therapy that no conventional medicine could have accomplished. The boy who had been rejected by his biological family found acceptance and purpose that validated his worth in ways that genetic enhancement could never have achieved, while the pirate who had sacrificed his mobility for a stranger's life discovered that some treasures were more valuable than any gold or jewels he had accumulated during his years of plundering. The weight of debt that Sanji felt towards Zeph gradually transformed from burden into motivation, his recognition that he could never fully repay what had been given becoming driving force behind his determination to become worthy of such sacrifice. Each perfectly prepared meal became offering to the man who had chosen to preserve his life, each successful defense of Bharati's principles, a validation of the values that had inspired such extraordinary generosity. The floating restaurant that rose from shared dreams and mutual sacrifice became more than business venture or even sanctuary for the hungry. It was proof that human connections forged in extremity could create institutions that enriched the lives of everyone they touched. The foundation had been laid not just for successful restaurant, but for the kind of relationship that would sustain both men through whatever trials awaited them in the years ahead, their bond stronger than blood because it had been chosen rather than inherited, tested in circumstances that revealed the true depth of their commitment to each other and the ideals they shared. The morning that would change everything began like countless others at Bharati, with the gentle rocking of the floating restaurant creating the rhythm that had become the heartbeat of Sanji's daily existence. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface unmarked by any vessel larger than the fishing boats that occasionally brought fresh catches to supplement their already impressive stores. The kitchen hummed with the familiar sounds of preparation as Sanji and the other cooks readied ingredients for what they expected to be another routine day of serving meals to the usual mixture of pirates, merchants, and marines who had learned to appreciate both their food and their neutrality. The crash that shattered this peaceful morning routine came not from the sea but from the sky, a small vessel plummeting toward their deck with the kind of reckless velocity that suggested either desperate circumstances or complete disregard for conventional navigation. The Going Merry struck Bharati's hull with impact that sent tremors throughout the floating restaurant, her amateur repair work and makeshift modifications telling the story of a crew that possessed more enthusiasm than maritime experience, but had somehow managed to survive long enough to develop genuine seamanship skills. From the damaged vessel emerged a young man whose presence seemed to fill spaces far larger than his actual physical dimensions should have allowed, his straw hat catching the ocean breeze as if it were a crown, marking him as someone destined for greatness that he had not yet fully grown into. Monkey D. Luffy's first words upon boarding Baratie were not apologies for the damage his ship had caused, but expressions of wonder at the delicious aromas that wafted from the kitchen, his priorities so clearly established that even strangers could immediately understand what motivated him most deeply. The confrontation with Lieutenant Fullbody provided Sanji's first opportunity to demonstrate the principles that governed his approach to life. The arrogant marine's casual waste of perfectly prepared food, triggering protective instincts that had been refined through years of understanding hunger's true cost. The lieutenant's assumption that his uniform granted him license to treat food as mere commodity rather than sacred sustenance revealed the kind of fundamental misunderstanding about life's priorities that Sanji could not allow to pass unchallenged within the walls of their sanctuary. The kick that sent Fullbody flying through Baratie's window was delivered not in anger but in correction, Sanji's leg moving with precision that spoke to years of practice, combining combat effectiveness with restraint that prevented permanent injury while making unmistakable points about acceptable behavior. The marine's splash as he hit the ocean below served as punctuation to a lesson that would be remembered by every patron present. Their understanding of Baratie's true nature deepened through witnessing the swift consequences that awaited those who confused hospitality with weakness. Zeph's response to this display carried the complicated mixture of pride and frustration that characterized their relationship, his public criticism of Sanji's actions, masking private satisfaction that his student had absorbed the lessons about protecting their establishment's core values, while maintaining the kind of measured force that disabled enemies without creating martyrs. The old pirate's awareness that customers needed to understand the boundaries of acceptable behavior was balanced by his recognition that excessive violence could transform their restaurant from sanctuary into battleground. The arrival of Jin marked the first real test of Baratie's founding principles, the starving pirate's desperation, creating the kind of moral situation that revealed character more clearly than any philosophical discussion could achieve. His dramatic entrance, punctuated by the shooting of a marine who had been pursuing him, should have marked him as exactly the kind of dangerous customer that any reasonable establishment would refuse to serve, yet the hunger in his eyes spoke to suffering that transcended whatever crimes might have brought him to this moment. The other patron's refusal to feed Jin reflected understandable caution about associating with someone whose violent actions had just demonstrated his willingness to kill for survival, but their practical concerns about safety and reputation could not compete with the fundamental principle that had inspired Baratie's creation in the first place. The sight of a human being slowly dying from starvation while surrounded by abundance represented everything that Sanji and Zeph had sworn to prevent when they committed their lives to ensuring that no one would endure what they had experienced on that barren rock. Sanji's decision to prepare a meal for Jin was made not through careful consideration of consequences, but through instinctive response to suffering that demanded relief regardless of the complications such relief might create. The simple act of placing food before someone who had been reduced to begging for sustenance carried weight that extended far beyond nutrition, acknowledging Jin's humanity at a moment when desperation had nearly stripped away his ability to recognize it in himself. The tears that flowed down Jin's face as he consumed the meal spoke to more than mere gratitude for physical nourishment. They represented the restoration of hope that had been systematically destroyed by weeks of rejection and the growing certainty that death by starvation was preferable to the loss of dignity that continued begging would require. Each bite became affirmation that someone in the world still believed he deserved to live, that his past actions had not permanently disqualified him from receiving basic human compassion. Luffy's observation of this exchange provided his first real insight into Sanji's character. The recognition that here was someone whose strength was not measured merely in combat ability, but in the courage required to treat enemies as human beings deserving of care rather than punishment. The invitation that followed was delivered with the straightforward simplicity that characterized all of Luffy's important decisions, his certainty that Sanji belonged on his crew, based not on tactical considerations, but on fundamental compatibility of values that made formal explanations unnecessary. Sanji's initial refusal carried its own complications, his loyalty to Zeph creating obligations that could not be dismissed simply because better opportunities presented themselves elsewhere. The debt that bound him to Bharati was not financial contract that could be negotiated or dissolved through legal mechanisms, but moral commitment that encompassed his entire sense of identity and purpose. The man who had sacrificed his leg to preserve Sanji's life deserved better than abandonment disguised as career advancement, regardless of how appealing the prospect of adventure might seem. The punishment duty that relegated Luffy to chore boy status provided opportunity for both young men to observe each other in circumstances that revealed character more clearly than formal interviews could accomplish. Luffy's cheerful acceptance of manual labor that other pirates might have considered beneath their dignity demonstrated the kind of humility that was often absent from those who proclaimed themselves destined for greatness, while his obvious appreciation for the food served at Bharati showed understanding of quality that went beyond mere hunger satisfaction. The gossip that Luffy absorbed during his time working in the restaurant painted complicated portrait of the relationship between Sanji and Zeph, their public arguments masking private affection that neither man felt comfortable expressing directly, but which influenced every interaction they shared. The other cook's stories revealed the depth of sacrifice that had created their floating sanctuary, but also the continuing tension between Sanji's dreams of finding all blue and his sense of obligation to the man who had made those dreams possible through his own willingness to surrender everything that had previously defined his identity. The flirtation that erupted between Sanji and Nami provided comic relief that masked serious character development. His immediate infatuation with the orange-haired navigator, revealing both the romantic idealism that shaped his interactions with women and the loneliness that years of devotion to work had created in his personal life. The exaggerated courtesy and elaborate compliments that he showered upon her spoke to his understanding that women deserved treatment that acknowledged their worth as more than mere objects of desire, though his methods sometimes undermined his sincerity through sheer excess. Zeph's suggestion that Sanji should join the Straw Hats carried implications that extended far beyond simple career advice. The old pirate's recognition that his student had outgrown their floating restaurant, creating new tensions in relationship that had been built around mutual dependence and shared purpose. The permission that seemed like liberation felt more like abandonment to Sanji, whose entire adult identity had been constructed around his role as Zeph's student and eventual successor, rather than independent agent pursuing his own destiny. The return of Don Krieg transformed what had been philosophical discussions about loyalty and obligation into immediate crisis that would test every principle that governed Bharati's operations. The most feared pirate in the East Blue arrived not as conqueror, but as supplicant, his defeat at the hands of Dracul Mihawk, having reduced his mighty armada to a handful of survivors clinging to life through sheer stubbornness, and the kind of desperate hope that could sustain people far beyond the point where rational analysis suggested they should surrender. Krieg's polite request for food provided perfect example of how desperation could temporarily mask the true nature of those who had built their reputations through cruelty and intimidation. His courteous demeanor during the initial interaction, creating false sense of security that would soon be shattered by the revelation of his actual intentions. The performance he delivered while consuming the meal that Sanji prepared demonstrated the kind of calculated manipulation that had made him successful as pirate captain, his ability to project vulnerability when it served his purposes, masking the predatory instincts that remained unchanged despite his recent defeat. The betrayal that followed his feeding was as inevitable as sunrise, Krieg's true nature asserting itself the moment his immediate physical needs had been satisfied, and he possessed sufficient strength to resume the kind of behavior that had made him legendary throughout the East Blue. The blow that he delivered to Sanji's jaw carried symbolic weight beyond its physical impact, representing the ingratitude that seemed to characterize those who viewed kindness as weakness rather than strength, who interpreted generosity as evidence of foolishness that deserved exploitation rather than reciprocation. The demand that followed, surrender of Barati itself to serve as Krieg's new flagship, revealed the full scope of his ambitions and the casual way he viewed other people's life work as resources available for his consumption. The restaurant that had been built through years of sacrifice and dedication was reduced in his mind to useful vessel that could be appropriated through superior firepower, its history and purpose dismissed as irrelevant compared to his immediate needs for transportation and base of operations. The 100 starving pirates who accompanied Krieg represented moral dilemma that struck at the heart of everything Barati claimed to stand for, their genuine suffering creating sympathy that complicated the clear-cut opposition their leader's behavior should have inspired. Sanji's insistence on feeding them despite the obvious dangers such charity would create demonstrated his commitment to principles that transcended tactical considerations, his understanding that hunger was hunger, regardless of the political complications that might result from addressing it. The suspicion that this decision aroused among Barati's other cooks reflected reasonable concerns about the wisdom of strengthening enemies who would undoubtedly use that strength against them, but also revealed the fundamental difference between Sanji's absolute commitment to their founding principles and others' more pragmatic approach to restaurant management. The suggestion that he might be working as Krieg's spy spoke to fears that such unwavering idealism might mask ulterior motives, that no one could maintain such consistency without hidden agenda that would eventually be revealed. Zeph's preparation of the 100 meals resolved the immediate crisis, while demonstrating that Sanji's principles were not individual eccentricity, but natural extension of the values that had inspired Barati's creation in the first place. The old pirates' efficient production of food sufficient to restore the strength of their potential enemies represented commitment to ideals that prioritized moral consistency over tactical advantage, the understanding that some principles were worth maintaining, regardless of the personal costs such maintenance might require. The battle that erupted after Krieg's forces had been restored to fighting strength provided final demonstration of why such feeding had been necessary despite its obvious dangers. The moral authority that came from having honored their commitment to help anyone who needed food, creating unity among Barati's defenders that could not have been achieved through appeals to self-interest alone. The knowledge that they had acted according to their highest principles, even when doing so created disadvantages, provided strength that mere tactical superiority could never have supplied. The truth about Sanji and Zeph's relationship emerged during this crisis, not through exposition but through action, their willingness to risk everything to protect each other, revealing bonds that transcended conventional categories of family or professional association. The story of their survival on the barren rock became more than historical curiosity. It was explanation for the loyalty that made them fight with desperation of people defending everything that gave their lives meaning rather than mere business interests. The resolution of the Krieg crisis through Luffy's intervention provided validation of the ideals that had governed Sanji's response to the situation. The young pirate's victory, achieved not through superior strategy, but through commitment to protecting people whose generosity deserved defense rather than exploitation. The defeat of someone who viewed kindness as weakness demonstrated that moral courage could generate practical strength, that treating others with dignity was not naivety, but wisdom that understood the true sources of power in human relationships. The aftermath of battle created space for the conversations that would determine whether Sanji's future lay with the floating restaurant that had been his home for years, or with the crew of dreamers who had proven themselves worthy of the loyalty he had learned to value above all other virtues. The choice that awaited him would test everything he had learned about duty, desire, and the courage required to pursue dreams that might lead away from safety toward uncertainties that could not be calculated or controlled through careful planning. The conspiracy that would liberate Sanji from his own sense of obligation began in the quiet moments after battle, when the adrenaline of combat had faded and the reality of what their victory meant started to settle into the consciousness of everyone who called Barati home. Zeph watched his student tend to the wounded with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to value every life regardless of the circumstances that had brought injury. The old pirate's weathered face, revealing emotions that years of deliberate gruffness had trained most observers to overlook entirely. The conversation between Zeph and the other cooks took place in whispered conferences that Sanji was meant to overhear, their careful planning, designed to appear spontaneous, while actually representing the most calculated performance any of them had ever attempted. The head chef's instructions were delivered with the kind of precision normally reserved for complex recipes, each cook receiving specific roles in the deception that would follow, their individual contributions coordinated to create the illusion of genuine rejection rather than carefully orchestrated liberation. The first hints of change appeared in small gestures that might have seemed insignificant to casual observers, but carried devastating weight for someone whose entire sense of identity was built around belonging to this floating community. The morning greeting that went unanswered, the request for assistance that was met with indifferent shrugs, the gradual exclusion from conversations that had previously included him as natural participant, each slight carefully calculated to create growing sense of isolation, without crossing the line into obvious cruelty. Sanji's initial confusion at this treatment reflected his complete inability to imagine that the people he considered family could harbor genuine resentment against him, his mind searching for explanations that would preserve his understanding of relationships that had sustained him through years of growth and development. The possibility that his actions during the Krieg crisis might have created lasting damage to bonds he had considered unbreakable introduced doubts that ate away at confidence built through countless shared experiences. The criticism of his cooking represented perhaps the cruelest element of their performance. Each dismissive comment about dishes he had prepared with the same care and attention that had always earned praise striking at the heart of his identity as chef and valued member of their community. The meals that were rejected as inadequate or sent back to the kitchen with complaints about seasoning and presentation carried implications that extended far beyond mere culinary assessment to encompass fundamental questions about his worth as person and professional. The gradual escalation of this treatment followed psychological principles that none of the conspirators fully understood, but which their instinctive grasp of human nature allowed them to implement with devastating effectiveness. The isolation that began with small slights evolved into more direct rejections, their collective behavior creating atmosphere of hostility that would have been unbearable if Sanji had not possessed the resilience built through years of surviving far worse treatment at the hands of his biological family. But this current suffering was more painful than anything his brothers had inflicted precisely because it came from people whose love he had never questioned, whose acceptance had provided the foundation for rebuilding his sense of worth after the destruction wrought by Judge's experiments and cruelty. The possibility that even these relationships could be withdrawn created existential crisis that threatened to undermine everything he had learned about himself during his years at Bharati. The breaking point approached as Sanji began to seriously consider that his presence might genuinely be unwelcome, that his commitment to feeding anyone who needed sustenance regardless of consequences might have finally exhausted the patience of people whose practical concerns about restaurant operations took precedence over abstract principles about universal hospitality. The growing certainty that he had become burden rather than asset created emotional pain that no physical injury could match. The rejection by chosen family cutting deeper than biological family's abandonment ever could. Zeph's performance throughout this period required perhaps the greatest acting ability of anyone involved. His natural affection for Sanji buried beneath layers of calculated indifference that must have caused him genuine anguish to maintain. The old pirate's harsh comments about Sanji's usefulness and future prospects were delivered with the same gruff authority that had always characterized his teaching, but now carried implications of finality that suggested these assessments represented permanent judgments rather than temporary disappointments. The overheard conversation between Zeph and Luffy provided the revelation that transformed Sanji's understanding of everything that had been happening. The discovery that the man he considered his father was actively seeking to arrange his departure, shattering whatever illusions remained about the true nature of his welcome at Bharati. The request that Luffy take Sanji away from the restaurant carried weight that extended far beyond simple career advice to encompass what seemed like desperate desire to be rid of burden that had become too troublesome to bear. Luffy's refusal to accept this arrangement reflected his understanding that meaningful relationships could not be forced or manipulated, that Sanji's decision to join his crew would have value only if it emerged from genuine choice rather than circumstances engineered by others. The young pirate's insistence that such important decisions belonged to the individuals they affected demonstrated wisdom that his carefree demeanor often concealed, his respect for personal autonomy creating space for authentic decision-making rather than convenient solutions. The moment of revelation, when Sanji realized the true nature of what had been orchestrated, arrived not through dramatic confrontation, but through gradual accumulation of details that finally painted a clear picture of the deception that had been constructed around him. The tears that he had witnessed Zeph trying to hide, the guilty expressions that crossed the other cooks' faces when they thought he was not observing, the careful coordination that had been required to maintain such consistent rejection, all pointed toward explanation that was both more painful and more loving than anything he had initially imagined. The understanding that Zeph loved him enough to endure the agony of pretending to reject him created emotional complexity that threatened to overwhelm Sanji's ability to process what such sacrifice meant for his understanding of duty, loyalty, and the obligations that bound him to the floating restaurant. The recognition that his mentor was willing to bear the reputation of cruel dismissal rather than trap him in situation that limited his potential transformed what had seemed like abandonment into its opposite, the ultimate expression of paternal care disguised as its absence. The decision that followed this revelation was made not through careful analysis of options and consequences, but through instinctive recognition that some gifts were too precious to refuse, that Zeph's sacrifice would be dishonored if Sanji allowed practical concerns about debt and obligation to prevent him from accepting the freedom that had been purchased at such emotional cost. The choice to join Luffy's crew represented not abandonment of his mentor, but fulfillment of everything that Zeph had tried to teach him about courage, dreams, and the importance of pursuing destinies that match the scope of one's ambitions. The announcement of his decision carried weight that transcended mere career change to encompass transformation from student to independent practitioner of the principles he had learned during his years at Bharati. The words themselves were simple: agreement to serve as chef for the Straw Hat Pirates, but their implications reached into every aspect of his identity and understanding of what his life was meant to accomplish beyond the season. Safety of the floating restaurant's familiar routines. The preparation for departure revealed how deeply Sanji had become integrated into Bharati's daily operations, his absence from future service creating gaps that would need to be filled through redistribution of responsibilities among cooks whose skills had been developed under his indirect influence. The recipes he had perfected, the techniques he had adapted from Zeph's original methods, the relationships he had built with suppliers and regular customers, all represented investments in the restaurant's success that would continue generating value long after his physical departure. The packing of personal belongings became exercise in determining what aspects of his past were worth carrying into an uncertain future, each item requiring decisions about whether it represented essential connection to his identity or unnecessary weight that would impede his adaptation to new circumstances. The cookbook that had first introduced him to the concept of all blue naturally earned place in his limited luggage, while other possessions that had seemed important during his years of stable residence revealed themselves to be mere accumulations rather than treasures worthy of preservation. Luffy's enthusiastic gathering of meat supplies provided comic counterpoint to the emotional weight of Sanji's more carefully considered preparations. The future captain's approach to provisioning, reflecting his straightforward understanding that adventures required fuel, but that specific menu planning could be left to someone whose expertise in such matters had already been demonstrated. The contrast between their packing styles revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to life that would need to be reconciled during their upcoming journey together. The final confrontation with Zeph occurred not in privacy, but before the assembled staff of Bharati, their relationship's most important moment playing out in front of witnesses whose presence transformed personal farewell into public ceremony that acknowledged the significance of what was ending and what was beginning. The old pirate's call to his departing student carried all the formality of military dismissal, while concealing emotions that could not be directly expressed without undermining the fiction that this separation was practical necessity, rather than heartbreaking loss. The collapse that followed, Sanji falling to his knees as tears overwhelmed his ability to maintain composure, represented complete abandonment of the emotional restraint that both men had maintained throughout years of relationship characterized by gruff affection disguised as professional criticism. The gratitude that poured from him in broken sentences encompassed not just appreciation for specific lessons learned, but recognition of the comprehensive transformation that Zeph's influence had accomplished in converting broken child into capable adult, ready to pursue dreams that had seemed impossible when he first arrived at the floating restaurant. The promise that emerged through his tears, never to forget the man who had saved and shaped him, carried weight that transcended mere sentiment to become sacred vow that would influence every decision he made throughout whatever adventures awaited him in the wider world. The commitment to remember extended beyond simple nostalgia to encompass active dedication to embodying the principles he had learned, carrying forward the values that had made Bharati more than mere business enterprise. Zeph's own emotional breakdown, carefully hidden behind gruff dismissal that fooled no one present, revealed the depth of attachment that had developed between mentor and student over years of shared purpose and mutual respect. The tears that he tried to disguise as irritation at sentimental display spoke to loss that would leave permanent void in his daily experience, the absence of someone whose growth had provided meaning and satisfaction that mere business success could never replace. The final exchange, Zeph's insistence that real men should part without tears, followed by his own obvious failure to follow this advice, provided perfect summary of relationship that had always been characterized by emotional truth disguised as practical interaction. The contradiction between stated philosophy and actual behavior revealed how deeply both men had been affected by connection that neither had initially expected to develop, but which had become central to their understanding of what family could mean when chosen rather than imposed by accident of birth. The departure that followed was conducted with efficiency that masked the magnitude of change occurring for everyone involved. Sanji's transformation from permanent resident to departing guest, creating ripple effects throughout Barati's social structure that would require months or years to fully resolve. The ship that carried him away bore not just individual pursuing personal dreams, but representative of everything the floating restaurant had accomplished. In demonstrating that broken people could be healed through consistent application of love disguised as demanding expectations for excellence, the waves that carried the Going Merry toward new adventures reflected the endless cycle of departure and arrival that defined life on the ocean, but also marked specific moment when potential became kinetic, when dreams that had been discussed in abstract terms transformed into concrete plans requiring immediate action and sustained commitment. The floating restaurant that gradually disappeared behind them had served its purpose in preparing Sanji for challenges that would test everything he had learned, while demanding growth beyond what any training could fully anticipate. The crew member who joined the Straw Hat Pirates that day brought more than culinary skills and fighting ability. He carried forward the values and relationships that had shaped him during years of healing from childhood trauma, his integration into their small family representing continuation of patterns established at Barati while opening possibilities for new forms of connection and mutual support. The chef, whose kicks had become legendary within East Blue waters, was ready to test his abilities against challenges that would prove whether the foundation laid through Zeph's teaching could support whatever weight the Grand Line might place upon it. The Grand Line revealed itself to the Straw Hat Pirates, not through dramatic flourish, but through subtle changes in the very nature of the sea itself. The water beneath their keel carrying currents that seemed to operate according to principles that defied conventional understanding of maritime navigation. Sanji stood at the Going Merry's rail during those first days after their ascent of Reverse Mountain, his trained chef's palate detecting differences in the salt spray that spoke to minerals and influences drawn from depths that no East Blue waters had ever contained. The crew dynamics that had seemed natural during their brief time together in familiar waters underwent constant refinement as each member learned to accommodate the other's working styles and personal quirks within the confined space of their shared vessel. Sanji's integration into this floating family required adjustments that went beyond simple role assignment. His protective instincts toward Nami created complications with Zoro's more pragmatic approach to crew relationships, while his absolute devotion to food quality sometimes conflicted with Luffy's quantity-focused appetite and Usopp's tendency to experiment with provisions during lonely watch shifts. The kitchen that became Sanji's domain aboard the Going Merry was a masterpiece of efficient design, compressed into space that would have challenged even experienced ship's cooks, every inch utilized to maximum effect, while maintaining the organization necessary for preparing meals under conditions that could range from perfect calm to storm-tossed chaos. The adaptation of his Barati refined techniques to the limitations imposed by a much smaller galley demanded creativity that pushed his skills into new territories. Each successful meal prepared under adverse conditions, building confidence in his ability to maintain standards regardless of external circumstances. The first real test of their capabilities as a crew came not through direct confrontation with enemies, but through the complex political situation they encountered in Alabasta, where civil war threatened to tear apart an ancient kingdom, while hidden forces manipulated events according to agendas that remained concealed until almost too late to prevent catastrophe. Sanji's role in these events demonstrated intellectual capabilities that his flirtatious behavior and straightforward fighting style often concealed, his strategic thinking proving essential when conventional approaches to problem-solving proved inadequate. The alias he adopted during their infiltration of Crocodile's organization, Mr. Prince, carried implications that none of his crewmates could have understood at the time, the name reflecting subconscious acknowledgement of noble heritage that he had spent years trying to forget, while simultaneously suggesting that some aspects of identity could not be completely abandoned, regardless of conscious intentions to do otherwise. The ease with which he assumed this false persona spoke to familiarity with deception that went beyond simple tactical improvisation, suggesting depth to his background that even he might not have fully recognized. The spy work that followed their capture of several crew members showcased abilities that had nothing to do with culinary training or combat prowess. Sanji's natural gift for reading people and situations, allowing him to navigate complex social dynamics while maintaining cover identities that could have been exposed by anyone less skilled at understanding what others expected to see. The telephone conversations he conducted while impersonating various Baroque Works agents demonstrated acting abilities that transformed him temporarily into entirely different people, each performance calibrated to extract maximum information while arousing minimum suspicion. The rescue operation that freed his captured crewmates became template for the kind of behind-the-scenes work that would characterize many of Sanji's most important contributions to their adventures. His willingness to operate without recognition or credit, allowing him to accomplish objectives that more glory-seeking individuals might have compromised through excessive visibility. The satisfaction he derived from seeing his friends safe outweighed any disappointment at remaining unacknowledged for the planning and execution that had made their freedom possible. The relationship dynamics that developed during these early Grand Line adventures revealed personality traits that had been masked by the more formal atmosphere of Baraty's professional kitchen environment. The rivalry that emerged between Sanji and Zoro grew from mutual respect disguised as competitive hostility, each man recognizing qualities in the other that complemented his own strengths, while challenging his assumptions about effective approaches to common problems. Their arguments served as release valve for tensions that could have become destructive if allowed to accumulate without expression, their competition pushing both to higher levels of performance than either might have achieved alone. The monster trio dynamic that naturally formed around Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji represented more than simple recognition of superior fighting abilities. It acknowledged their willingness to accept responsibilities that went beyond personal safety to encompass protection of crew members whose specialized skills made them invaluable, but whose combat capabilities were less developed. The unspoken understanding that these three would bear the heaviest burden during serious conflicts created bonds of mutual dependence that transcended friendship to approach something closer to brotherhood forged in shared danger. Sanji's interactions with Nami during this period revealed both the sincerity of his romantic feelings and his complete inability to express them in ways that did not undermine their effectiveness through excessive display. The elaborate courtesies and expensive gestures that he showered upon her spoke to genuine desire to make her happy, while simultaneously creating barriers to authentic communication that prevented the development of the deeper relationship he claimed to desire. His failure to understand that love expressed through service could be more meaningful than love proclaimed through grand declarations would remain a consistent source of both comedy and missed opportunities. The development of his combat philosophy during these adventures reflected integration of techniques learned from Zeph with innovations demanded by opponents whose abilities operated according to principles that East Blue enemies had never demonstrated. The restriction of his hands to cooking purposes became more than mere personal preference. It evolved into sacred commitment that added psychological weight to every fight by ensuring that victory or defeat would be determined through willingness to maximize potential of self-imposed limitations, rather than abandoning principles for tactical advantage. The emergence of his tactical thinking as complement to Luffy's intuitive leadership and Zoro's straightforward combat approach created crew capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual parts. Sanji's ability to analyze complex situations and devise multi-stage solutions proving essential when brute force or inspirational speeches proved insufficient to address challenges they encountered. His contributions to their strategic planning were often subtle but consistently crucial, the kind of behind-the-scenes work that enabled more dramatic actions by others while remaining largely invisible to external observers. The first serious test of his loyalty came during the Water 7 crisis, when the Going Merry's structural failure created emotional trauma that threatened to tear apart relationships that had seemed unshakable during their previous adventures. The revelation that their beloved ship was beyond repair struck Sanji with particular force because he understood better than most crew members what it meant to lose something that had become integral to one's sense of identity, belonging, his own separation from Bharati having taught him the pain involved in necessary goodbyes. The conflict with Usopp over the Merry's fate revealed fault lines in crew dynamics that none of them had wanted to acknowledge. The sniper's desperate attachment to their ship, serving as proxy for deeper fears about his own value to their group, while highlighting questions about loyalty, practicality, and the courage required to accept painful truths. Sanji's support for Luffy's decision to abandon the Merry was based not on indifference to their ship's sentimental value, but on hard-earned understanding that clinging to what could not be preserved often prevented recognition of what could be saved. The Enies Lobby rescue mission that followed Robin's apparent betrayal and capture demonstrated the lengths to which the crew would go to retrieve someone they considered family. Their assault on a government fortress, representing declaration of war against forces that commanded resources far beyond anything they had previously challenged. Sanji's role in this operation showcased the full range of abilities he had developed since joining their crew. His combination of infiltration skills, tactical planning, and devastating combat effectiveness, proving essential to their ultimate success. The battle with Jabra, that served as his primary combat showcase during the Enies Lobby arc, represented more than simple test of fighting ability. It became demonstration of how completely he had integrated the lessons learned from Zeph with innovations demanded by Grand Line opponents whose powers operated beyond normal human parameters. The Wolfman's ability to combine human intelligence with animal instincts and enhanced physical capabilities should have provided overwhelming advantages, but Sanji's disciplined approach to combat created opportunities that raw power alone could not have achieved. The development of Diable Jambe during this battle marked crucial evolution in his fighting style. The technique that set his leg ablaze, representing synthesis of everything he had learned about channeling passion into practical application, without allowing emotion to override strategic thinking. The fire that surrounded his kicks was not mere special effect, but visible manifestation of inner strength that had been refined through years of training and tested through situations that had proven his commitment to protecting those who depended on him. The philosophy behind his unwillingness to use his hands for combat purposes was put to its most severe test during fights where such self-imposed limitations created significant tactical disadvantages. But his consistency in maintaining these boundaries, even when they threatened his survival, demonstrated that some principles were worth preserving regardless of immediate costs. The hands that remained dedicated solely to cooking represented commitment to values that transcended expedience, embodying belief that identity was defined by choices made under pressure rather than conveniences adopted during peaceful times. The victory over Jabra was achieved not through abandonment of his restrictions, but through creative maximization of capabilities that remained available within self-imposed boundaries, his spinning kicks generating enough friction to create flames that could penetrate even the iron body techniques that made CP9 agents nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks. The sight of his burning leg as it connected with his opponent's jaw became an iconic image that would be remembered long after the specific details of their battle had faded from public memory. The aftermath of the Eni's lobby mission saw the crew's bounties increase dramatically as the world government finally recognized them as genuine threats to global stability rather than mere nuisances that could be handled through routine law enforcement procedures. Sanji's bounty photograph became source of ongoing embarrassment and comic relief. The surveillance camera's failure to capture his actual face, resulting in wanted poster that featured crude sketch bearing little resemblance to his actual appearance, but ensuring that his criminal status would provide minimal interference with his ability to move freely in public. The recruitment of Frankie and Brooke during subsequent adventures expanded their crew capabilities while creating new relationship dynamics that required adjustment of established patterns of interaction and responsibility allocation. Sanji's position as the crew's cook remained secure, but his role as one of their primary tactical thinkers was supplemented by Frankie's engineering expertise and Brooke's vast experience gained through decades of sailing these same waters. Their collective knowledge, creating resources that individual members could never have achieved alone. The training that occupied the 2-year separation period following their defeat at Sabaudi Archipelago represented acknowledgement that their current abilities were insufficient for challenges that awaited them in the new world. Sanji's individual development occurring in isolation from his crewmates while remaining focused on his eventual reunion with the family that had given his life meaning beyond personal achievement. The specific nature of his training remained his private experience, but the results would prove essential when they finally faced opponents whose power operated on scales that their previous adventures had never approached. The reunion at Sabaudi demonstrated how much each crew member had grown during their forced separation, their individual improvements, combining to create collective capabilities that exceeded anything they had previously achieved, while maintaining the essential chemistry that made their cooperation both effective and personally satisfying. Sanji's visible development, his enhanced speed, improved technique, and expanded tactical understanding represented successful synthesis of everything he had learned during his exile, with the foundation that had been established through years of shared adventure and mutual dependence. The entry into the new world marked the beginning of challenges that would test not just their individual abilities, but their commitment to each other and the dreams that had brought them together in the first place. The waters ahead promised encounters with opponents whose power had shaped the current world order, their adventures moving beyond simple treasure hunting to encompass conflicts that could determine the future direction of human civilization itself. The cook, whose kicks had become legendary throughout the first half of the Grand Line, was ready to prove that techniques developed in East Blue waters and refined through battles against government agents could hold their own against emperors whose influence extended across multiple seas. The foundation laid through years of training under Zeph's guidance and tested through countless battles alongside his chosen family had prepared him for whatever trials awaited. His loyalty to his crewmates and commitment to his principles, providing strength that no external enemy could undermine or destroy. The catastrophe that befell the Straw Hat pirates at Sabaudi Archipelago began not with enemy action, but with their captain's unwavering commitment to principles that made compromise impossible when confronted with injustice so fundamental that tolerance would have constituted complicity. The sight of St. Charles raising his pistol toward Hatchan for the crime of existing in his presence triggered protective instincts in Luffy that operated below the level of conscious decision-making, his fist connecting with the world noble's face before rational consideration of consequences could interfere with moral imperative that demanded immediate response. The punch that echoed throughout the human auction house carried implications that extended far beyond physical assault to encompass rebellion against everything the celestial dragons represented, inherited privilege unchecked by accountability, power exercised without wisdom, cruelty justified through appeals to natural order that positioned some humans as inherently superior to others, regardless of character or accomplishment. The silence that followed this blow spoke to the magnitude of what had just occurred, every witness understanding that they had observed act of defiance that would reshape the political landscape in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Admiral Kizaru's deployment to Sabaody represented the world government's recognition that Luffy's attack constituted existential threat to systems of control that had maintained global stability for centuries. The light-based powers of Borsalino operating on scales that made conventional combat strategies meaningless, while demonstrating speed that transformed every encounter into test of reflexes that human nervous systems were not designed to possess. The casual efficiency with which he dismantled their attempts at resistance revealed the vast gulf that separated promising rookies from the pinnacle of marine strength. The arrival of Bartholomew Kuma elevated their desperate situation into something approaching apocalypse, the warlord's mysterious powers creating tactical challenges that went beyond anything they had previously encountered, while suggesting agenda that remained hidden behind impassive expression that revealed nothing of his true motivations. The paw pads that marked his palms possessed abilities that seemed to operate according to principles that defied conventional understanding of devil fruit limitations. His capacity to repel abstract concepts like pain and fatigue, making him effectively untouchable, while providing offensive capabilities that could end battles before opponents realized they had begun. Sanji's separation from his crew occurred not through defeat in fair combat, but through inexorable application of power that reduced their most desperate efforts to futile gestures against forces that operated beyond their ability to resist or comprehend. The paw-shaped bubble that enveloped him carried implications that extended far beyond simple transportation. It represented the first time since joining the Straw Hats that he had been rendered completely powerless to protect the people whose safety had become his primary responsibility and source of meaning. The trajectory that carried him across vast oceanic distances toward unknown destination provided time for contemplation that was both unwelcome and necessary. His isolation within Kuma's strange transportation method, creating space for reflection on how thoroughly their defeat had demonstrated the inadequacy of their current strength. The confidence that had been built through successive victories against increasingly powerful opponents was shattered by encounter with enemies whose capabilities made their previous accomplishments seem like children's games rather than meaningful preparation for new world challenges. Kamabaka Kingdom appeared on the horizon like fever dream made manifest, its architecture defying conventional aesthetic categories while advertising the unconventional nature of everything that occurred within its borders. The island's reputation as sanctuary for those who existed outside society's narrow definitions of acceptable gender expression had preceded Sanji's arrival through whispered stories that painted its inhabitants as either enlightened pioneers or dangerous deviants, depending on the prejudices of whoever was relating the tales. The awakening that marked his transition from unconsciousness to awareness of his new circumstances was accompanied by visual confusion that suggested either head injury more serious than he had initially realized, or reality that operated according to principles so different from his previous experience that adjustment would require fundamental revision of assumptions about how the world functioned. The figure tending his injuries possessed features that seemed to combine masculine and feminine characteristics in ways that challenged categories his mind insisted on maintaining, despite evidence that such rigid classifications were insufficient for describing what he was actually observing. Elizabeth's introduction to Kamabaka culture began with questions that seemed innocent enough on their surface, but carried implications that became increasingly disturbing as their conversation progressed, her inquiries about his interest in makeup and dresses creating growing sense of unease about the expectations that his presence on their island might have created among inhabitants whose lifestyle he had never seriously considered adopting for himself. The enthusiastic response that his polite affirmations generated suggested that his words had been interpreted as expressions of genuine desire rather than attempts to maintain courtesy during difficult social interaction. The revelation of Elizabeth's true nature, and by extension the nature of the entire Kamabaka population, created shock that went beyond simple surprise to encompass fundamental challenge to assumptions about worth, identity, attraction, and the relationship between appearance and reality that had never been questioned during his previous experiences. The realization that his romantic responses had been triggered by individuals whose biological nature differed from their presentation created cognitive dissonance that threatened his understanding of his own sexuality and the reliability of instincts he had never had reason to doubt. The pursuit that followed his desperate attempt to escape this unwelcome revelation transformed what should have been temporary visit into extended nightmare of misunderstanding and cultural clash. The Okamus's interpretation of his flight as denial of his true nature rather than genuine desire to leave, creating pursuit that would define every day of his exile on the island. Their absolute conviction that his resistance represented internalized shame about desires he was afraid to acknowledge made rational discussion impossible, while ensuring that every interaction reinforced their determination to help him embrace what they believed to be his authentic self. The palace audience with Caroline introduced him to the island's ruler, and the possibility of negotiation that might provide escape from circumstances that were rapidly undermining his sanity and sense of identity. But the terms offered for his freedom carried their own complications that demonstrated how thoroughly he had misunderstood the nature of the challenge he faced. The demand that he prove his worthiness through combat, conducted according to Okama traditions, transformed his request for transportation into trial by ordeal that would test more than simple fighting ability. The battle that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced, its rules and expectations operating according to principles that bore little resemblance to conventional combat, while forcing him to confront aspects of his own identity that he had never examined with the kind of critical attention that such examination required. The requirement that he fight while wearing dress and makeup was not mere humiliation but initiation into understanding of how arbitrary the boundaries were that separated acceptable from unacceptable expressions of human nature. Caroline's fighting style incorporated elements that challenged conventional understanding of martial arts, while demonstrating techniques that could only have been developed by someone who had spent decades exploring the relationship between movement, identity, and self-expression in ways that transcended simple physical conditioning. The grace that characterized every attack and defensive maneuver suggested that combat could be art form that revealed essential truths about practitioners' understanding of themselves and their place in the world. The psychological warfare that accompanied their physical confrontation proved more unsettling than any technique that relied purely on speed or strength. Caroline's analysis of Sanji's motivations and hidden desires striking at insecurities that he had not realized he possessed, while suggesting interpretations of his behavior that recontextualized every relationship and decision he could remember making. The suggestion that his chivalrous treatment of women masked deeper conflicts about his own gender identity created doubt that no amount of rational analysis could completely dispel. The transformation that occurred during their battle represented complete breakdown of psychological defenses that had been constructed over years of careful identity formation. Sanji's consciousness, temporarily overwhelmed by possibilities that his mind had previously rejected without serious consideration, but which suddenly seemed not just plausible, but inevitable. The version of himself that emerged from this mental collapse embodied everything he had feared about extended exposure to Kamabaka culture, while demonstrating how completely external influences could reshape internal understanding when resistance finally proved insufficient to maintain previous certainties. The newspaper that restored his awareness of external reality and responsibilities that transcended his current circumstances carried information that struck him like physical blow. The coverage of Marineford War and Luffy's desperate attempt to save Ace, creating perspective that rendered his personal struggles with identity questions irrelevant compared to his crew's need for his support during crises that threatened their very survival. The knowledge that his captain had endured tragedy of such magnitude, while he had been consumed with selfish concerns about his own comfort, generated shame that burned away confusion like fire consuming dead vegetation. The return to normal consciousness brought with it determination to use whatever time remained in his exile for productive preparation, rather than continued resistance to circumstances that could not be changed through complaint. Denial, his recognition that strength was more important than comfort, creating framework for approaching his training with renewed focus. The techniques that had initially seemed like torments designed to break his spirit were recontextualized as opportunities for growth that could contribute to his eventual reunion with the people whose safety provided his primary motivation for self-improvement. The 2 years that followed his psychological restoration were characterized by relentless pursuit of capabilities that his previous training had not addressed. His development of skywalking techniques emerging from desperate need to escape situations that conventional mobility could not resolve, rather than systematic instruction in advanced movement methods. The Okamas, who had initially seemed like threats to his identity, became inadvertent teachers whose lifestyle provided lessons about the courage required to live authentically despite social pressure to conform to others' expectations. The culinary opportunities that Kamabaka culture provided expanded his understanding of the relationship between food preparation and artistic expression. Their approach to cooking, incorporating elements of performance and visual presentation that challenged his assumptions about the purposes that meals were meant to serve beyond simple nutrition. The recipes he learned during his exile combined techniques from different cultural traditions in ways that created flavors he had never imagined possible, while demonstrating how artificial the boundaries were that separated one cuisine from another. The physical conditioning that resulted from constant pursuit by individuals whose romantic interests he did not reciprocate created cardiovascular fitness and agility that exceeded anything his previous training regimen had achieved. His development of enhanced speed and endurance emerging from necessity rather than planned exercise program. The irony that his most significant physical improvements came from running away from people rather than training to fight them was not lost on someone whose sense of humor had been refined through years of finding comedy in situations that might otherwise have been purely frustrating. The philosophical insights that emerged from prolonged exposure to lifestyle that challenged conventional gender roles provided perspective on the arbitrary nature of many social expectations, while highlighting the courage that was required to live according to internal convictions rather than external pressure to conform to others' definitions of acceptable behavior. The respect he developed for individuals who chose authenticity over comfort influenced his understanding of what strength actually meant, while providing models of integrity that operated independently of conventional measures of success or social approval. The meditation techniques that he developed as method for maintaining psychological equilibrium during circumstances that constantly challenged his sense of identity proved valuable for combat applications as well. His improved mental discipline, creating foundation for techniques that required precise coordination between physical action and spiritual focus. The calmness under pressure that he achieved through prolonged exposure to situations that initially overwhelmed his coping mechanisms would prove essential during battles that demanded clear thinking, despite overwhelming stress and immediate physical danger. The reunion with his crewmates at Sabaudi marked the end of separation that had tested every bond they had forged through shared adventure, while proving that relationships built on genuine compatibility could survive even prolonged isolation and individual growth that might have changed their fundamental natures. The joy of seeing familiar faces was tempered by awareness that they had all been transformed by their individual experiences in ways that would require adjustment of established patterns of interaction and mutual understanding. The visible improvements in his capabilities, enhanced speed that allowed him to move faster than most observers could track, skywalking abilities that provided tactical advantages in three-dimensional combat environments, refined fighting techniques that incorporated lessons learned from unconventional training methods, represented successful synthesis of everything he had experienced during his exile with the foundation that had been established through years of conventional martial arts instruction. Under Zeph's guidance, the entry into New World waters that followed their reunion carried implications that extended beyond geographical transition to encompass recognition that their adventures would now involve stakes that could affect entire populations, rather than individual crews or small communities, their actions potentially influencing the global balance of power in ways that their previous experiences had never approached. The responsibilities that accompanied such potential influence required maturity and wisdom that could only be developed through exposure to situations that tested character as well as capability. The transformation that had occurred during their separation was not limited to individual skill development, but encompassed collective evolution into crew whose combined abilities could challenge established power structures while maintaining commitment to principles that prioritize protection of innocent people over personal advancement or glory. The cook, whose kicks had been refined through desperate flight from unwanted romantic attention, was ready to prove that strength developed under unusual circumstances could prove just as effective as power gained through conventional training methods. The trials that awaited them in waters controlled by emperors, whose influence shaped entire nations, would test everything they had learned about cooperation, sacrifice, and the courage required to maintain moral principles when doing so created disadvantages that more pragmatic individuals would have avoided through compromise. The foundation that had been laid through separation and individual growth would now support collective efforts that could determine whether their dreams were achievable aspirations or mere fantasies that would be crushed by opponents whose power had been proven through decades of successful domination. The bounty poster that arrived at Zoo carried implications that extended far beyond its crude monetary value. The peculiar designation of only alive, marking Sanji as fundamentally different from his crewmates, whose wanted notices offered the standard choice between capture and elimination. The sum itself, 177 million berries, represented recognition of his individual threat level that would have been flattering under different circumstances. But the restriction on his treatment suggested forces operating behind the scenes with agendas that had nothing to do with normal law enforcement procedures. The mystery surrounding this unusual bounty condition created unease that Sanji attempted to dismiss through rational analysis, his mind searching for explanations that would preserve his understanding of himself as ordinary pirate, whose only distinguishing characteristics were culinary skills and fighting techniques that relied exclusively on leg-based combat. The possibility that his past contained elements significant enough to influence world government policy decisions was one he had spent years successfully avoiding through careful maintenance of distance from anything connected to his origins. The Mink tribe's hospitality provided temporary distraction from concerns about what the bounty's peculiarities might foreshadow, their enthusiastic acceptance of human visitors, creating atmosphere of celebration that made it easy to focus on immediate pleasures rather than abstract worries about potential future complications. Sanji's interactions with the female minks of Zo demonstrated both his unchanged appreciation for feminine beauty and his complete inability to recognize that his romantic attention might be culturally inappropriate or personally overwhelming to recipients who had not requested such focused admiration. The peace that characterized their stay on the ancient elephant's back was shattered by the arrival of two ships whose presence immediately transformed their temporary sanctuary into potential battlefield. The vessel's approach carrying implications that extended far beyond simple visits from travelers who had happened upon their location through coincidence or navigation error. Peacom's leonine features and Big Mom's Jolly Roger announced connections to power structures that operated on scales the Straw Hats were only beginning to understand, while Capone Bege's reputation preceded him across waters that whispered stories of his methodical approach to eliminating obstacles that interfered with his carefully laid plans. The conversation that followed Pecom's recognition of services the Straw Hats had provided to the Mink tribe during Jack's devastating attack revealed layers of obligation and debt that connected their small crew to political networks spanning multiple seas and involving players whose influence could reshape entire regions according to their whims. The gratitude expressed by the lion mink for their protection of his people created moral complexity that transformed what should have been straightforward criminal encounter into negotiation between parties who possessed legitimate reasons for respecting each other despite their opposing positions. Caesar Clown's terror at the sight of Big Mom's representatives spoke to consequences that extended far beyond simple business disagreements, his panicked explanations revealing the kind of contractual failures that could result in elimination of entire research teams along with their families and anyone who had provided them assistance. The scientist's description of his relationship with the Emperor painted picture of obligation that had been entered into carelessly and abandoned through cowardice, leaving debts that accumulated interest, calculated not in berries but in years of life expectancy. The revelation that the Straw Hats themselves had already earned Big Mom's enmity through their actions at Fishman Island created strategic situation that offered no easy solutions. Their protection of that underwater kingdom, having established them as obstacles to expansion plans that emperors did not abandon, simply because implementation proved more difficult than originally anticipated. Luffy's casual declaration of war against one of the four most powerful pirates in the world was beginning to generate consequences that would test every alliance they had forged and every skill they had developed. Pecom's offer to overlook their presence in exchange for Caesar represented the kind of practical compromise that experienced criminals learn to accept when faced with situations that offered no perfect outcomes. His willingness to fabricate reports that would satisfy his superiors while avoiding unnecessary conflict, demonstrating wisdom that came from years of navigating the treacherous politics surrounding emperor-level organizations. The Lion Mink's gratitude for their assistance to his people created opportunity for mercy that might never be repeated once the moment passed. Capone Bege's intervention demonstrated that even reasonable negotiations could be disrupted by individuals whose approach to problem-solving prioritized dramatic gestures over careful diplomacy. His shooting of Pecom's, representing the kind of casual betrayal that characterized relationships built on fear rather than mutual respect. The mafia boss's transformation of his body into fortress capable of housing multiple prisoners revealed devil fruit abilities that operated according to principles unlike anything the Straw Hats had previously encountered, his internal architecture providing tactical advantages that conventional combat strategies could not address. The interior of Bege's body fortress existed as pocket dimension that defied normal understanding of spatial relationships, its corridors and chambers providing environment where hostages could be maintained indefinitely while their captor conducted business that might extend across multiple islands and several months of travel time. The surreal experience of being imprisoned within another person's physical form created psychological pressure that was designed to break resistance through sheer alienation from normal reality, rather than conventional torture or intimidation. The wedding invitation that Bege delivered carried implications that transformed Sanji's understanding of his relationship to the wider world. The formal announcement of his impending marriage to Charlotte Pudding, revealing connections between his past and present that he had spent years believing were permanently severed. The identity that had been carefully constructed through years of independence from his biological family was suddenly revealed as incomplete fiction, his legal name and noble heritage, creating obligations that had never been formally renounced, despite his personal rejection of everything they represented. The shock of learning that his father had arranged political marriage without consultation or consent demonstrated how thoroughly Judge continued to view his third son as asset to be deployed, according to strategic necessity rather than individual human being, whose preferences deserved consideration in decisions that would determine the direction of his entire life. The casual assumption that Sanji would comply with arrangements made on his behalf revealed Judge's fundamental inability to accept that his rejection by this particular child had been permanent rather than temporary rebellion that would eventually be resolved through application of sufficient pressure. Vito's whispered revelation of the leverage that had been acquired to ensure Sanji's cooperation struck at vulnerabilities that careful analysis of his personality had identified as points where resistance could be broken through. Application of precisely targeted threats. The specific nature of what was threatened remained unspoken, but its effectiveness was immediately apparent in Sanji's transformation, from defiant captive to resigned participant in arrangements that violated every principle he had spent years developing about personal autonomy and freedom of choice. The letter that Sanji wrote to his crewmates represented an attempt to explain circumstances that could not be fully described without revealing information that would only increase their danger. His carefully chosen words, designed to communicate both his continuing loyalty to their shared cause and his recognition that some situations demanded sacrifice of individual happiness for the sake of collective survival. The apology that accompanied his departure acknowledgement of failure to maintain the kind of strength that would have allowed him to protect both his chosen family and the innocent people whose lives had been placed at risk through his connection to them. The decision to remain with Caesar as human shield ensured that his crewmates' escape would not be pursued with the full force that Big Mom's organization could have deployed. His willingness to accept captivity in exchange for their freedom, representing the kind of calculated sacrifice that demonstrated how completely his priorities had evolved from self-preservation to protection of others. The tears in his friends' eyes, as they were forced to abandon him, spoke to bonds that had been forged through years of shared adventure and mutual dependence, relationships that made separation feel like amputation, regardless of the rational justifications that made such separation necessary. The journey toward Big Mom's territory aboard ships that flew the Jolly Roger of one of the 4 most powerful pirates in the world provided time for contemplation of how dramatically his circumstances had changed within the space of a few hours, his transformation from free man pursuing dreams of finding all blue to political prisoner being transported toward arranged marriage that would serve purposes completely unrelated to his personal desires or capabilities. The ocean that had once represented infinite possibility now carried him toward future that had been determined by others according to agendas that treated his individual will as irrelevant variable in calculations that encompassed entire pronged kingdoms and their strategic relationships. Baron Tamago's attempts at persuasion during the voyage revealed the sophisticated understanding that Big Mom's organization possessed regarding the psychological approaches most likely to succeed with different types of captives. His appeals to Sanji's presumed ambitions for advancement and security, demonstrating how thoroughly they had misunderstood the values that actually motivated his choices. The egg-shaped man's descriptions of the benefits available to high-ranking members of the Big Mom pirates painted picture of luxury and power that held no appeal for someone whose dreams were focused on discovery and creation rather than accumulation and domination. The photograph of Charlotte Pudding that was presented as inducement to cooperation revealed young woman whose apparent beauty and gentle demeanor seemed to promise that the arranged marriage might not prove as burdensome as Sanji's initial assumptions had suggested. His immediate romantic response to her image, demonstrating how completely his weaknesses had been analyzed and exploited by those who had orchestrated his capture. The possibility that genuine affection might develop within the context of forced political union created complex emotional landscape that made simple resistance impossible, while offering no guarantee that cooperation would lead to anything resembling happiness. Vito's enthusiasm for Germa 66 revealed the extent to which his family's reputation had spread throughout the criminal underworld, their scientific achievements and military capabilities earning respect and fear that extended far beyond the North Blue territories where their power had been most directly demonstrated. The fanboy admiration that the Big Mom pirates' subordinate displayed toward Vinsmoke technology and philosophy created uncomfortable reminder of heritage that Sanji had spent years attempting to forget, his family's legacy continuing to influence world events, despite his complete disconnection from their activities and goals. The 3 days that passed during their journey provided insufficient time to process the magnitude of change that his capture represented, each sunrise bringing him closer to reunion with family members whose cruelty had shaped his understanding of human nature, while simultaneously carrying him toward future that had been designed without reference to his preferences or dreams. The meals that were served aboard the ship reminded him of everything he would be forced to abandon if the marriage proceeded as planned. His career as chef for the Straw Hat Pirates, representing freedom that had been more valuable than any treasure they might have discovered during their adventures together. The first meeting with Charlotte Pudding exceeded even his optimistic expectations regarding what might be possible within the constraints of arranged marriage. Her genuine kindness and apparent nervousness, suggesting that she was as much victim of political machinations as he was rather than willing participant in schemes designed to advance her mother's imperial ambitions. The awkwardness of their initial conversation revealed shared recognition that circumstances had placed them in situation neither had chosen, creating foundation for sympathy that might eventually develop into something approaching genuine affection if they were granted sufficient time to understand each other without external pressure. The possibility that she might be willing to help him return to his crew represented hope that arrangements made by their respective parents might be circumvented through cooperation between the intended spouses. Her whispered assurances that solutions could be found, providing first reason for optimism he had experienced since his capture at Zoo. The promise implicit in her words suggested that not all members of the Charlotte family were willing participants in their mother's schemes. That individual conscience might create opportunities for resistance that careful planning could exploit. The approach to Whole Cake Island revealed Big Mom's territory in all its artificial splendor. The candy-constructed landscapes creating visual impression of fantasy made manifest, while concealing the sophisticated military organization that maintained order throughout her domain. The anthropomorphic objects that populated every surface spoke to devil fruit powers that operated on scales beyond anything Sanji had previously encountered. Their cheerful appearances, masking surveillance network that would make escape virtually impossible, even for someone who possessed detailed knowledge of the island's geography and defenses. The floating kingdom of Germa that awaited his arrival represented reunion he had hoped never to experience. The mechanical precision of his family's military organization, serving as reminder of everything he had rejected when he chose freedom over power during his childhood escape. The ships that locked together to form temporary nation demonstrated technological capabilities that had advanced significantly during the years since his departure, their integration creating fortress that could challenge conventional naval forces while maintaining mobility that made retaliation difficult for enemies who lacked similar innovations. The conversation with Reiju that preceded his reunion with Judge provided opportunity to understand how political situation had developed to the point where his cooperation had become essential to plans that had been years in the making. Her explanation of their father's strategy, revealing ambitions that encompassed restoration of Vinsmoke influence throughout North Blue territories that had been lost through previous military defeats. The marriage alliance with Big Mom represented opportunity to acquire resources and protection that would make such restoration feasible, transforming Sanji from rejected son into essential component of schemes that required his participation regardless of his personal preferences. The meeting with Judge that followed carried all the emotional weight that years of separation and resentment could create. The father who had rejected him as failure, now demanding his cooperation in plans that depended upon his unique position as member of both Vinsmoke family and Straw Hat crew. The casual assumption that time and circumstances would have weakened his resistance to family authority demonstrated Judge's continued inability to understand the depth of transformation that freedom had accomplished in his third son's character and priorities. The explosive cuffs that were placed upon his wrists while he processed the full scope of the trap that had been constructed around him represented physical manifestation of constraints that had been designed to ensure compliance through threat of consequences that would extend far beyond his personal welfare to encompass everyone who had shown him kindness during his years of independence. The key that remained in Big Mom's possession meant that his freedom would depend upon her continued satisfaction with his cooperation, creating dependency relationship that could persist indefinitely regardless of what the future might bring. The wedding ceremony that would serve as centerpiece for the most elaborate deception ever attempted within Big Mom's territory began its final preparations, while the true scope of the conspiracy that surrounded it remained hidden from most of the participants, each faction believing they understood the complete picture while remaining ignorant of the layers of betrayal that had been woven into every aspect of the celebration. The chapel that had been constructed for the occasion represented architectural marvel that combined the aesthetic preferences of both families involved in the alliance, its soaring spires and candy-coated decorations creating visual spectacle that would be remembered long after the political implications of what occurred there had reshaped the balance of power throughout the New World. The gathering of guests represented unprecedented assembly of criminal organizations, revolutionary movements, and legitimate governments whose representatives had traveled from across the globe to witness union that promised to alter the fundamental structure of pirate politics. The Charlotte family's extensive network of alliances created attendance lists that read like comprehensive catalogue of everyone who possessed significant influence within the underworld, while the Vinsmoke delegation brought connections to military contractors and scientific research organizations whose technologies could tip the balance in conflicts that had been simmering for decades without resolution. Sanji's preparation for his role in this elaborate charade required him to suppress every instinct that had been developed through years of freedom and self-determination. His transformation into compliant groom demanding psychological compartmentalization that threatened to damage aspects of his identity that had taken decades to construct. The formal wear that had been selected for him carried symbolic weight that extended beyond mere fashion choices to encompass complete submission to arrangements that had been made without his consultation. Each perfectly tailored seam representing another restriction on autonomy that had once seemed unshakable. The mask that Reiju had applied to conceal the injuries inflicted by his brothers served practical purpose, while providing metaphorical representation of how thoroughly his authentic self would need to be hidden during the ceremony that would follow, the artificial skin creating barrier between his true feelings and the performance that political necessity demanded he deliver before audience, whose expectations had been shaped by years of anticipation. The weight of this disguise was measured not in physical discomfort but in psychological pressure that accumulated with each passing hour as the moment of final commitment approached. Pudding's apparent nervousness, as she prepared for her own part in the ceremony, seemed to confirm Sanji's hope that genuine affection might provide foundation for relationship that could transcend the political calculations that had created their engagement. Her shy smiles and whispered reassurances suggesting that she viewed their marriage as opportunity for happiness rather than mere duty to be endured for her family's benefit. The possibility that love might grow from arrangement that had begun through coercion offered hope that sustained him through preparations that would have been unbearable if he had believed the union would prove nothing more than elaborate prison designed to contain his spirit indefinitely. The coordination required to maintain multiple layers of deception while ensuring that each faction's plans could proceed according to schedule demanded organizational skills that pushed Big Mom's event planning capabilities to their absolute limits, every detail requiring careful consideration of how it would be perceived by observers whose reactions could determine whether the various conspiracies succeeded or failed catastrophically. The wedding cake that served as centerpiece for the celebration carried significance that extended far beyond its culinary excellence to encompass structural elements that would prove crucial when the carefully orchestrated chaos finally erupted. The alliance between Luffy and Capone Bege represented cooperation between individuals whose fundamental approaches to problem-solving could hardly have been more different. The future Pirate King's instinctive heroism creating tactical complications for plans that had been designed around systematic application of overwhelming force at precisely calculated moments. The gangster's frustration with his temporary partner's inability to follow complex instructions was balanced by recognition that Luffy's unconventional methods often achieved results that careful planning could never have anticipated. The infiltration of Big Mom's forces by members of the Straw Hat crew required skills that went far beyond simple combat effectiveness to encompass the kind of espionage capabilities that none of them had been formally trained to employ, their success depending upon improvisation and audacity rather than careful preparation or sophisticated equipment. Brooks' unique abilities made him particularly valuable for reconnaissance missions that would have been impossible for living infiltrators. His status as animate skeleton providing advantages that no amount of conventional training could have duplicated. The timing that would determine the success or failure of their elaborate scheme depended upon coordination between groups whose communication capabilities were limited by necessity of maintaining cover identities that could not be exposed through careless revelation of information that enemies were actively seeking to discover. The mirrors that served as communication network throughout Big Mom's territory created opportunities for coordination while simultaneously providing surveillance capabilities that made every conversation potentially dangerous if overheard by the wrong individuals. The Mother Caramel portrait that served as key element in their strategy represented psychological vulnerability that Big Mom had spent decades concealing from potential enemies. The photograph's significance extending far beyond sentimental attachment to encompass traumatic memories, whose activation could create temporary incapacitation in someone whose normal state approached invulnerability. The plan to destroy this image during the wedding ceremony required precise timing that would maximize the window of opportunity, while minimizing the chances that countermeasures could be implemented before their objectives were achieved. Caesar Clown's reluctant participation in the conspiracy resulted from coercion rather than willing cooperation, his scientific expertise providing capabilities that were essential to their plans, while his obvious desire to avoid involvement created reliability concerns that had to be addressed through combinations of threats and bribes that appealed to both his fears and his remaining professional ambitions. The poison gas that he prepared for the assassination attempt represented synthesis of his most deadly research, with delivery systems that had been adapted specifically for the unique challenges presented by their targets' known resistances and defensive capabilities. The procession that carried Sanji and Pudding toward the altar moved with ceremonial dignity that concealed the multiple layers of deception and counter-deception that surrounded every aspect of the event, each participant playing roles that had been rehearsed extensively while remaining unaware of how their individual performances contributed to larger patterns that would determine the fate of everyone present. The cloud that bore them above the assembled guests provided perfect staging for dramatic revelations that would transform celebration into battlefield within moments of their occurrence. Sanji's lifting of Pudding's veil should have revealed the face of his bride in moment of traditional intimacy that would seal their union before witnesses whose approval would legitimize whatever political arrangements had been negotiated by their families, but instead provided opportunity for him to demonstrate the genuine kindness that had been masked by years of painful experience with rejection and abandonment. The third eye that Pudding had expected would trigger revulsion, instead inspired compliments that struck at insecurities she had carried since childhood, his sincere appreciation for features she had learned to view as deformities, creating emotional crisis that threatened to derail assassination plans that depended upon her cold-blooded execution of predetermined script. The tears that followed his unexpected acceptance represented breakdown of psychological barriers that had been constructed through years of training designed to eliminate human weakness from someone whose devil fruit abilities required emotional detachment to function effectively. Her sobbing before assembled witnesses, creating spectacle that transformed wedding ceremony into dramatic performance that no one had anticipated. The confusion that spread through the audience reflected their collective inability to understand what they were observing, their expectations for political theatre disrupted by display of genuine emotion that belonged to romance rather than strategic alliance. The priest's attempt to proceed with assassination despite the obvious disruption of their carefully planned timeline demonstrated how thoroughly the conspirators had committed to their course of action regardless of complications that might arise during execution. His raised weapon, creating moment of truth that would determine whether months of preparation would culminate in victory or catastrophic failure. The shot that was intended to end Sanji's life represented point of no return for conspiracy that had already invested too much to consider retreat, regardless of what obstacles might emerge during the crucial moments that followed. Katakuri's intervention, using his advanced observation, Haki created tactical situation that none of the conspirators had anticipated. His ability to perceive future events allowing him to counter their assassination attempt through methods that turned their own weapons against them, while demonstrating capabilities that operated far beyond normal human limitations. The jelly bean that he launched with lethal precision served as reminder that even the most carefully planned operations could be disrupted by opponents whose powers transcended conventional understanding of what was possible in combat situations. The emergence of multiple Luffys from the wedding cake represented culmination of infiltration efforts that had required days of preparation and coordination between crew members whose individual skills had been combined to create capabilities that none of them could have achieved independently. Their dramatic appearance, transforming formal ceremony into chaotic battlefield, where previous alliances and enmities became irrelevant compared to immediate survival concerns. The destruction of the cake that had been intended to serve as centerpiece for celebration created symbolic disruption that paralleled the collapse of political arrangements that had taken years to negotiate. Sanji's protective response to Pudding's obvious distress demonstrated that his capacity for compassion extended even to those who had deceived him, his instinctive desire to shield her from harm overriding rational considerations about whether such protection was deserved or strategically advisable. The bullets that she fired in his direction carried less genuine murderous intent than psychological confusion, resulting from years of conditioning that had taught her to view emotions as weaknesses that needed to be eliminated through violence against their sources. The revelation of Pudding's genuine feelings through her tears and desperate attempts to complete her assigned mission created moral complexity that transformed what should have been straightforward rescue operation into situation where clear distinctions between enemies and victims became impossible to maintain. Her obvious internal conflict generating sympathy that complicated tactical decisions about how she should be treated during the chaos that followed. The slap that her brother delivered for her failure to execute their plans according to schedule demonstrated how thoroughly she was trapped between conflicting loyalties that offered no resolution that would satisfy both her family, obligations, and her emerging genuine emotions. The shattering of Mother Caramel's portrait achieved its intended psychological effect while failing to generate the complete incapacitation that had been hoped for. Big Mom's reaction proving less predictable than intelligence gathering had suggested, while still creating opportunity for action that would not have been possible under normal circumstances. The screams that followed the destruction of her treasured photograph carried power that transcended mere emotional expression to become physical force that influenced everyone within range of their impact. The rescue of the Vinsmoke family by their supposedly traitorous son represented vindication of values that Judge had spent years trying to eliminate from his children. Sanji's willingness to risk his own safety for people who had shown him nothing but cruelty, demonstrating that compassion could not be bred out of human nature through any amount of scientific manipulation or deliberate abuse. The irony that his intervention saved lives that his father had placed in jeopardy through arrangements that treated family members as expendable resources was not lost on observers who understood the psychological dynamics that had shaped their relationships. The battle that erupted throughout the chapel tested every alliance that had been forged in preparation for this moment, while creating new opportunities for cooperation between former enemies, whose survival now depended upon their ability to work together against threats that exceeded any individual's capacity to overcome through solitary effort. The Vinsmoke raid suits that finally emerged from storage provided technological advantages that had been deliberately withheld from earlier conflicts. Their advanced capabilities, creating tactical opportunities that shifted the balance of power in ways that none of the conspirators had fully anticipated. The explosion that brought down the whole Cake Chateau served as punctuation mark for conspiracy that had succeeded in disrupting Big Mom's political arrangements, while failing to achieve the complete victory that would have eliminated her as threat to future operations. The partial success creating situation where all parties involved would need to reassess their strategic positions while dealing with immediate consequences of their choices. The destruction that followed transformed celebration into disaster that would be remembered as turning point in New World politics, marking moment when established power structures began to shift in ways that would influence events for years to come. The escape that followed required cooperation between groups whose previous relationships had been characterized by mutual distrust and conflicting objectives, their shared need for survival, creating temporary alliances that transcended political differences while providing foundation for future coordination that might prove essential as consequences of their actions continued to unfold. The chaos that surrounded their retreat provided cover for activities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, allowing them to achieve objectives that conventional assault could never have accomplished. The wedding that had been intended to symbolize union between two of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, instead became catalyst for conflicts that would reshape the political landscape throughout the seas, controlled by emperors whose influence had previously seemed unshakable. The failure of careful planning demonstrating that human emotions could not be controlled through manipulation or coercion when they encountered authentic expressions of values that transcended self-interest. The bonds that had been forged through genuine connection proved stronger than arrangements that had been negotiated through purely strategic considerations, creating outcomes that no amount of careful analysis could have predicted. The wedding cake that would serve as their final gambit represented more than culinary achievement. It was architectural marvel that would need to satisfy the most demanding palate in the world, while being constructed under conditions that made normal baking procedures impossible to implement. The 3-hour deadline that governed their efforts transformed what should have been leisurely creative process into desperate race against time, each minute lost to indecision or technical difficulties bringing them closer to catastrophic failure that would doom everyone they were trying to save. Pudding's emotional volatility during the preparation process created complications that went far beyond simple mood swings to encompass fundamental questions about her ability to maintain the kind of focus that their task demanded. Her alternating expressions of love and murderous rage towards Sanji, making it impossible to predict whether she would prove asset or liability. when crisis moments arrived. The psychological damage that years of abuse and manipulation had inflicted upon her psyche was manifesting in ways that threatened their mission, while simultaneously generating sympathy that made it difficult to treat her purely as tactical resource whose cooperation could be commanded rather than requested. Chiffon's presence provided stabilizing influence that helped counterbalance Pudding's unpredictability while contributing expertise that had been developed through years of professional experience in Big Mom's most demanding culinary environments. Her understanding of her mother's preferences, creating framework for decisions about ingredients and preparation methods that would maximize their chances of achieving the kind of transcendent flavor experience that could calm even the most violent rampage. The betrayal she was committing by assisting in their efforts carried potential consequences that extended to her husband and children, her willingness to accept such risks demonstrating courage that went far beyond simple family loyalty. The Cacao Island factory that served as their base of operations had been transformed into war zone by Oven's pursuit of his traitorous sister, the extreme temperatures that his devil fruit powers generated, creating environmental hazards that threatened to compromise their delicate baking processes, while simultaneously making it impossible for normal humans to approach their work area without protective equipment that was not readily available. The heat that radiated from his angry presence served as constant reminder that discovery would mean immediate and violent retribution for everyone involved in the conspiracy against his family's interests. Sanji's design for the replacement wedding cake demonstrated synthesis of everything he had learned about advanced pastry construction during his years at Bharati, with innovations demanded by the unique challenges presented by their current circumstances. His blueprint, revealing architectural understanding that went far beyond simple cooking to encompass engineering principles that would allow the finished product to support its own massive weight while maintaining structural integrity during transportation across hostile territory. The precision required for such construction pushed his technical skills to their absolute limits, while demanding creativity that transformed familiar techniques into entirely new approaches to solving problems that no conventional training could have anticipated. The Sim Sim cream that served as his secret ingredient represented culmination of research that had been conducted throughout his culinary career. The recipe emerging from years of experimentation with flavor combinations that could create the kind of emotional response that transcended mere taste satisfaction to encompass psychological effects that bordered on the supernatural. The sweetness that characterized this creation was so intense that experienced chefs found themselves overwhelmed by single tastes, their professional composure dissolving into expressions of pure bliss that suggested they had encountered something that operated beyond normal sensory experience. The coordination required to complete such complex construction within their abbreviated timeline demanded perfect synchronization between team members whose previous experience working together was limited to brief conversations and brief, shared meals. Their success depending upon intuitive understanding of each other's strengths and limitations rather than rehearsed procedures that could be implemented without constant communication. The trust that developed during their frantic collaboration created bonds that transcended the political differences that should have made such cooperation impossible under normal circumstances. The 31 chefs whose memories had been modified by Pudding's devil fruit abilities provided workforce that was essential to achieving their objectives, while remaining completely ignorant of the true nature of what they were, accomplishing their manipulated consciousness, allowing them to work with enthusiasm and skill that would have been impossible if they had understood the treasonous implications of their actions. The artificial happiness that characterized their demeanor throughout the process created atmosphere of celebration that masked the desperate urgency that motivated their supervisor's every decision. The moment when one of the assistant chefs collapsed after tasting the Sim cream provided dramatic demonstration of the power contained within Sanji's creation, while creating concerns about whether such intensity might prove dangerous to their ultimate target, the possibility that Big Mom could be harmed rather than pacified by their offering, adding new variables to calculations that were already operating at the margins of what seemed physically possible. The declaration that he could die happy after experiencing such perfect sweetness spoke to transcendent quality that elevated their work beyond mere cooking into something approaching religious experience. The packaging and transportation of the finished cake required engineering solutions that had never been attempted under such conditions, the delicate construction needing to survive journey across terrain that included ocean voyages, hostile territory, and potential combat situations while maintaining the pristine appearance that would be necessary to achieve maximum psychological impact upon presentation to their target. The protective measures they implemented represented improvised genius that combined available materials in ways that created capabilities their individual components could never have possessed independently. The ambush by oven that threatened to destroy everything they had accomplished demonstrated how quickly careful planning could be disrupted by enemies whose emotional investment in preventing their success outweighed tactical considerations about the wisdom of confronting opponents whose capabilities remained largely unknown. The heat that radiated from his fury transformed their escape route into hellscape that threatened to incinerate the cake they had worked so desperately to create, while simultaneously putting their lives at risk through exposure to temperatures that exceeded human tolerance levels. Sanji's intervention in the battle that followed showcased combat techniques that had been refined through 2 years of intensive training while demonstrating his willingness to risk everything to protect work that represented more than culinary achievement. It embodied hope for resolving crises that threatened everyone he cared about, while potentially preventing catastrophic loss of life that would result if their mission failed. The kick that sent Oven flying through the air carried power that had been developed through desperation rather than formal instruction, his strength emerging from determination that transcended normal human limitations when motivated by sufficient emotional investment in the outcome. The rescue of Chiffon from her brother's murderous rage required split-second timing that left no margin for error, while demonstrating the kind of protective instincts that had been honed through years of defending people who could not defend themselves. Sanji's natural chivalry extending to encompass anyone whose suffering was being inflicted by those who possessed superior physical power. The satisfaction visible on his face as he swept her to safety spoke to deep-seated need to prove that strength could be used for protection rather than domination. That power was most meaningful when applied in service of others rather than advancement of personal interests. Bege's arrival in his tank ship hybrid created tactical opportunities that would not have existed if conventional rescue had been attempted. The unique capabilities of his vessel providing solutions to transportation problems that had seemed insurmountable given the hostile environment they were operating within, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of creative problem-solving that characterized successful criminal organizations. The coordination between former enemies that his intervention represented marked significant evolution in their working relationship, shared objectives creating foundation for cooperation that transcended previous antagonisms. The perfect execution of their cargo transfer demonstrated skills that could only have been developed through years of practice with similar high-stakes operations. Sanji's kick launching their precious creation with precisely calculated force that would deliver it safely to the deck of Bege's vessel without compromising its structural integrity or artistic presentation. The trajectory he achieved through pure physical ability eliminated need for mechanical assistance, while showcasing the kind of precision that separated true masters from merely competent practitioners of any discipline. Pound's sacrifice to protect his daughter and their mission represented ultimate expression of paternal love that had been denied outlet for decades. His willingness to face certain death in order to provide them with opportunity to escape, creating delay that would prove crucial to their ultimate success, while demonstrating that even characters who seemed peripheral to main events could play decisive roles when circumstances demanded heroic action. The blow he delivered to Owen, despite knowing it would result in fatal retaliation, spoke to values that transcended self-preservation when family was at stake. The flight toward the rendezvous with Luffy and the others provided opportunity for final preparations that would determine whether their elaborate gambit could achieve its intended psychological effect. The decoration of their creation during transportation, requiring steady hands and artistic vision that could function despite turbulence and time pressure that would have defeated less skilled practitioners. The collaborative effort between former enemies that characterized their final preparations demonstrated how shared purpose could create unity that political differences could not prevent when survival depended upon success. The reunion with Nami and Brook carried emotional weight that went beyond simple joy at seeing familiar faces to encompass relief that their separation had not resulted in casualties that would have made their sacrifices meaningless. The tears and embraces they shared, speaking to bonds that had been tested by circumstances, but proven strong enough to survive whatever trials their adventures might impose. The warmth of their welcome provided emotional sustenance that had been absent during his time among people whose motivations remained fundamentally alien to his understanding of what relationships should provide. The search for Luffy that followed their reunion represented race against time that carried implications, extending far beyond simple crew coordination to encompass recognition that their captain's individual battle against Katakuri was a determining factor in whether their collective efforts would prove sufficient to escape Big Mom's territory with their lives and freedom intact. The urgency that drove their flight toward the mirror world reflected understanding that some fights could not be won through group effort but required individual excellence that surpassed normal human limitations. The final conversation with Pudding, before their paths diverged, permanently provided opportunity for resolution of emotional complications that had developed during their forced cooperation. Her tears at his expression of gratitude demonstrating that genuine feelings had developed despite the artificial circumstances that had brought them together. The kiss that followed represented both culmination of romantic tension that had characterized their interactions and farewell to possibilities that political realities would never allow to be explored further. The memory modification that immediately followed this moment of intimacy ensured that Sanji would carry no recollection of either the physical affection he had received or whatever request had accompanied it. Pudding's decision to erase this experience from his consciousness, representing final act of protection that allowed her to express her true feelings without burdening him with knowledge that could only cause pain during the separation that was inevitable. The selflessness that characterized this choice spoke to genuine love that prioritized his emotional well-being over her own desire for acknowledgement or reciprocation. The delivery of their completed wedding cake to Fluffy Island represented culmination of efforts that had required cooperation between individuals whose natural inclinations toward trust or collaboration had been overcome through shared recognition that their survival depended upon success of mission that none of them could have accomplished independently. The precision with which they executed this final phase of their plan demonstrated skills that had been developed through necessity rather than training. Improvisation elevated to art form, through repeated exposure to situations that demanded excellence or death. Big Mom's reaction to their creation exceeded even optimistic projections of what might be achieved through application of superior culinary technique to ingredients that had been selected and prepared with unprecedented care and attention to detail. The ecstasy that she experienced upon tasting their offering transformed her from rampaging monster into blissful child, her reversion to state of innocent happiness, providing vivid demonstration of how completely the right food could alter psychological state, even in individuals whose normal condition approached invulnerability through sheer force of then personality. The song that emerged from her satisfaction represented unprecedented display of vulnerability from someone whose public persona was built entirely around intimidation and the threat of violence. Her musical expression of joy, creating moment of beauty that transcended the artificial nature of their relationship, while providing proof that their desperate gambit had achieved its intended effect. The rampage that had threatened to destroy entire fleets was replaced by celebration that honored the skill and dedication they had demonstrated through their collaborative effort. The escape that followed Big Mom's pacification required coordination between multiple groups, whose previous cooperation had been limited to brief tactical alliances, their success depending upon ability to maintain unified purpose despite political differences that would resume importance once immediate crisis had been resolved. The cover provided by Judge and his forces represented acknowledgement of debt that could never be fully repaid. His protection of Son, who had rejected everything he stood for, demonstrating that family bonds could transcend ideological disagreements when circumstances demanded such transcendence. The final confrontation between Judge and Luffy provided perfect summary of philosophical differences that separated those who viewed strength as tool for domination from those who understood power as means for protection. The Vinsmoke Patriarch's inability to comprehend why anyone would value Sanji's compassionate nature, revealing blindness that made his scientific achievements meaningless compared to his failure as father and human being. Luffy's dismissive response to criticisms of his cook's character demonstrated confidence in his crew's worth that transcended external validation or approval from those whose values he found incomprehensible. The raid suit that Niji had secretly provided represented final gesture of respect from family that had never previously acknowledged Sanji's worth. The advanced technology contained within its compact form, offering capabilities that could prove essential during future conflicts, while simultaneously serving as reminder of heritage that he had spent years trying to forget. The decision of whether to utilize this gift would test his ability to separate useful resources from unwelcome associations, practical considerations balanced against emotional complications that had shaped his entire adult identity. The raid suit that had traveled with them from Whole Cake Island remained sealed within its canister, like a promise that Sanji was not yet ready to accept, its presence aboard the Thousand Sunny serving as constant reminder of heritage he had spent years attempting to forget, while representing technological capabilities that could prove essential during conflicts that lay ahead. The advanced germa science contained within that compact cylinder embodied everything he had rejected about his family's approach to power, enhancement through artificial means rather than growth through dedication and training, shortcuts that eliminated the struggle that gave strength its meaning. The journey to Wano country provided time for contemplation of how completely his understanding of family had been transformed through his experiences with the Straw Hat crew, their acceptance of his quirks, and unwavering support during his darkest moments, creating bonds that biology could never have achieved. The contrast between relationships built on genuine affection and those imposed through accident of birth had never been more apparent than during his recent confrontation with the Vinsmokes, their inability to comprehend his values serving as validation of every choice he had made since escaping their sterile kingdom years earlier. The decision to finally utilize the raid suit when circumstances in Wano demanded capabilities beyond what his natural abilities could provide was made not through acceptance of his family's philosophy, but through pragmatic recognition that useful tools could be separated from the ideologies that had created them. The invisibility that the suit provided during his infiltration of the bathhouse demonstrated how advanced technology could serve noble purposes when wielded by someone whose moral compass remained uncorrupted by the power such technology represented. The psychological impact of wearing Germa technology was more significant than he had anticipated. Each activation of the suit's capabilities creating internal conflict between satisfaction at increased effectiveness and revulsion at relying upon enhancements that had been developed through methods he found morally reprehensible. The efficiency with which he could complete missions while invisible spoke to the tactical advantages that scientific advancement could provide, but also highlighted the ethical questions that arose when such advantages came at the cost of authentic achievement earned through personal effort and sacrifice. The third activation of the raid suit triggered changes in his physiology that had remained dormant since his childhood exposure to Judge's genetic modifications, the dormant enhancements suddenly awakening within his cellular structure like seeds that had been waiting decades for proper conditions to begin their growth. The realization that his mother's sacrifice to preserve his humanity had only delayed rather than prevented the transformation his father had intended created existential crisis that struck at the very foundation of his understanding of his own identity and the sources of his strength. The enhanced durability that began manifesting during his battles in Onigashima represented everything he had feared about becoming like his emotionless brothers. His body's ability to withstand damage that should have been crippling, suggesting that he was losing the vulnerability that made him human while gaining capabilities that had been artificially imposed rather than earned through dedication and training. The sword that shattered against his skull without leaving meaningful damage provided tangible evidence that his genetic modifications were overriding the natural limitations that had always defined his existence. The internal struggle that accompanied these physical changes was more traumatic than any external injury he had ever endured. The possibility that he might lose his capacity for emotion, creating terror that exceeded any fear of death or defeat he had previously experienced. The humanity that his mother had died to preserve represented the core of everything that made him valuable to his crewmates and worthy of the sacrifices that others had made on his behalf. Its potential loss threatening to transform him into the kind of hollow weapon that Judge had always intended him to become. Queen's taunts about his family heritage during their climactic battle struck at insecurities that the recent awakening of his modifications had made impossible to ignore. The Beast Pirate executive's mockery of his emotional nature, serving as preview of what his existence might become if the genetic changes continued to progress unchecked. The possibility that his capacity for love, loyalty, and compassion might be systematically eliminated by scientific processes he could not control, created desperation that fueled his fighting to levels that exceeded anything his previous battles had demanded. The moment when his enhanced healing abilities allowed him to continue fighting, despite injuries that should have ended the battle, demonstrated both the power and the horror of what he was becoming. His body's refusal to acknowledge damage that would have incapacitated normal humans, suggesting that he was evolving beyond the limitations that had always connected him to the people he cared about most. The satisfaction that should have accompanied such dramatic improvement in his combat effectiveness was poisoned by recognition that each enhancement distanced him further from the humanity he valued above all other qualities. The decision to destroy the raid suit represented more than simple rejection of useful equipment. It was declaration of independence. from everything the Vinsmoke name represented. His willingness to sacrifice tactical advantages in favor of preserving his authentic self, demonstrating that some prices were too high to pay, regardless of what benefits they might provide. The flames that consumed the advanced technology served as funeral pyre for the last connection between his current identity and the sterile perfection that had been planned for him before birth. The symbolism of burning Germa science while standing in the ruins of Kaido's fortress was not lost on observers who understood the philosophical implications of his choice. His destruction of artificial enhancement in favor of strength earned through struggle, providing perfect counterpoint to the themes that had characterized the entire Wano conflict. The liberation he felt as the suit's remains scattered on the wind spoke to relief that came from making peace with aspects of his nature that could not be changed while rejecting those that could still be controlled through conscious choice. The realization that his enhanced physical capabilities would likely persist despite the destruction of the device that had triggered them created new challenges for understanding what it meant to maintain his humanity while possessing abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The integration of genetic modifications with naturally developed skills would require conscious effort to ensure that increased power did not corrupt the values that had guided his development since escaping his family's, quote, influence. The philosophical discussions with his crewmates about the nature of strength and the sources of power that truly mattered provided framework for understanding how enhanced abilities could be wielded in service of authentic principles rather than becoming ends in themselves that justified abandonment of moral considerations. Their acceptance of whatever changes might occur in his physical capabilities, combined with their confidence that his essential character would remain unchanged, offered reassurance that identity was determined by choices rather than circumstances beyond individual control. The evolution of his fighting style to incorporate genetic enhancements while maintaining the philosophical foundations that had always guided his combat approach required creative adaptation that pushed his technical skills into entirely new territories. The synthesis of natural talent refined through years of training with artificially enhanced capabilities, created fighting effectiveness that exceeded anything he had previously achieved, while preserving the moral framework that made such power meaningful rather than merely impressive. The responsibility that accompanied increased capabilities demanded corresponding growth in wisdom and restraint, his enhanced strength requiring greater care to ensure that enemies were defeated rather than unnecessarily destroyed, while maintaining the protective instincts that had always motivated his involvement in combat situations. The balance between effectiveness and compassion became more delicate as the consequences of miscalculation became more severe, each battle serving as lesson in the proper application of power that exceeded normal human parameters. The integration into the crew's new power structure following their collective growth during the Wano conflict required adjustment of established patterns of cooperation and mutual support, his enhanced abilities complementing rather than replacing the relationships that had been built through years of shared adventure and sacrifice. The recognition that he remained fundamentally the same person despite physical changes provided foundation for maintaining the emotional connections that gave his existence meaning beyond mere personal achievement or recognition. The ongoing search for All Blue took on new dimensions as his enhanced capabilities created possibilities for exploration that had not existed when his dreams were constrained by normal human limitations. The legendary sea becoming more achievable goal, while simultaneously representing test of whether increased power would corrupt the motivations that had originally inspired his culinary ambitions. The question of whether finding his ultimate destination would satisfy his deepest longings or merely create new challenges remained unanswered as their journey continued toward whatever discoveries awaited in waters yet unexplored. The cooking techniques that evolved to accommodate his enhanced physical abilities, while maintaining the artistic principles that had always guided his culinary development, created new possibilities for the kinds of meals he could prepare and the number of people he could serve simultaneously. The efficiency gains that resulted from genetic modifications were channeled into greater service to others rather than personal convenience, his increased capabilities becoming tools for expressing love and care on scales that had not previously been possible. The mentorship role that naturally developed as younger cooks sought to learn from his techniques required him to articulate principles that had previously been instinctive, the process of teaching others helping to clarify his own understanding of what it meant to maintain authenticity while adapting to circumstances that had not been chosen but could not be avoided. The wisdom that emerged from successfully navigating the integration of enhancement with principle provided guidance that extended beyond culinary applications to encompass broader questions about identity and growth. The legacy that would eventually define his contributions to the Straw Hat Crew's success was being written through daily choices that demonstrated how increased power could serve authentic values rather than corrupting them. His example providing model for how enhancement could strengthen rather than replace the qualities that made individuals valuable to their communities. The cook, whose kicks had become legendary, was evolving into something greater while remaining fundamentally himself, proving that change and continuity could coexist when guided by principles that transcended circumstances. The future battles that awaited their crew would test every aspect of his development, while providing opportunities to demonstrate that strength derived from authentic sources could not be undermined by external circumstances, regardless of how dramatic those circumstances might prove to be. The foundation that had been laid through years of training, reinforced through trials that had tested his commitment to his values, and enhanced through genetic modifications that had been integrated rather than allowed to dominate, created capabilities that would prove essential as their adventures moved toward climaxes that would determine the future direction of the world itself. The man who had once been rejected by his biological family for possessing too much humanity had grown into someone who could serve as bridge between the enhanced and the natural, demonstrating through his example that power and compassion could be combined in ways that strengthened both while creating possibilities that neither could achieve independently. The journey from abandoned prince to irreplaceable crew member was approaching its climax, but the destination remained unwritten as their ship sailed toward horizons that promised challenges worthy of everything he had become. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary chronicle, though Sanji's story continues to unfold across seas that stretch toward infinite horizons filled with adventures yet to be written. From the broken prince who fell from artificial grace to the cook whose heart proved stronger than any scientific enhancement, we have witnessed transformation that speaks to the power of chosen family over inherited circumstance, of dreams pursued through dedication rather than shortcuts, of strength that serves others rather than dominating them. The boy who once cowered behind an iron mask has become a man whose kicks can shatter mountains while his hands create meals that nourish souls as well as bodies. His journey reminds us that the greatest treasures are not discovered but cultivated. The bonds forged in shared struggle, the principles maintained, despite overwhelming pressure to abandon them, the humanity preserved even when artificial perfection beckoned with promises of easier paths to power. Rest now, gentle dreamer, and let the aroma of distant spices carry you toward peaceful slumber filled with dreams of legendary seas where impossible ingredients await those brave enough to seek them. Tomorrow will bring new adventures, new opportunities to choose compassion over convenience, new reasons to believe that some recipes for happiness can only be perfected through the patient application of love, loyalty, and the unwavering conviction that every person deserves a place at the table where dreams are served alongside hope, seasoned with the eternal promise that the best meals are always shared with family.